Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Bright and early on Saturday morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Martin Tully. It's my privilege to serve as the mayor of this village. We have the entire village council and village staff here today. Appreciate everyone coming out, especially at our advanced meeting time. We'll try not to make a habit out of this, but we appreciate everyone being here nonetheless. This is the first budget meeting for the fiscal 2014 budget. This is one of a number of meetings, and we'll go through the schedule in a little bit in terms of the meetings we're going to have. Look at that. It's already up on the wall behind me. Love the staging. So this is the very first meeting that we're going to have before we actually approve the budget, which will be much later in time. So there'll be many opportunities for discussion, input, questions, and we look forward to all of it. Hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to review the actual budget document, which has been posted on our village website since, I believe, at least Friday. And it's a very handsome document that is chock full of information that is incredibly easy to read and understand. And on behalf of myself and the entire village council, I want to thank staff, particularly our financial department, for all the work that they do in providing the good numbers that we get to report in the document. And making it available to everyone. So with that introduction, this is, again, as I mentioned, the first discussion of the budget that has been proposed. Council will have discussion opportunities for questions. There'll be opportunities for public comment and questions as well. And so we look forward to a good discussion with everyone. At this point, I'll turn things over to Village Manager David Fieldman to provide an overview of the document and today's process.
And right on cue, the mayor has taken all the welcoming comments right per slide. Thank you very much, Mayor. The overview, the budget is really a one-year implementation of many multi-year plans. If you've been following the village, you know that we spend a lot of time doing strategic planning in a variety of realms and facets. And so we rely on many planning documents to produce the budget for us, and that means that the budget becomes a one-year implementation plan of many plans. What it means is we spend a lot of time doing strategies and laying out what we plan to do, and therefore the budget really comes now with no surprises. Certainly that is the intent, and I think what we have here today. The key points, the takeaways. First and foremost, we are sustainable in our main operating fund. Revenues and expenses are in line. We are on a track for sustainability. That comes after years of working to achieve this sustainability in our main operating fund. This year, we will show you how we are improving the use of fund balances and reserves and putting our risk management fund to better use to avoid budget amendments and to put more of our money to work for us. The next key point is that the National Affordable Health Care Act does affect the village of Downers Grove. We are ready for it, and we will show you what the impacts of that Affordable Care Act are to the village of Downers Grove. On the property tax levy, we have some good news to report. You'll hear today that the property tax levy for all of our operations remains unchanged. The only increases are the increases that are mandated by the state for contributions to the police and fire pension funds, and those contributions are defined by state regulations. What we wanted to spend a significant amount of time on this morning, and what we'll start with, is our continued investment in infrastructure. We have continued funding for our newly created stormwater utility. We'll talk about where that money comes from, what those revenues should be, how they should be paid, and how we'll put that money to work in our stormwater system. And it does allow for continued investment in our street systems, water systems, and sidewalks. So we'd like to jump right in today. Today's agenda, you see over here on the whiteboard, we'll get started first with stormwater and other capital funds like water and streets and sidewalks. Then we'll take a break. Then we'll go into our general operating funds and related funds, perhaps getting all the way through all other funds. The times on here are just to help us for guideposts, and certainly if the conversation takes us in a different direction, we respond accordingly. Whatever we don't get through today, we can get through at future council meetings. Any questions on what we're talking about today before I hand it over to Nan?
I think we're all understanding of the process. Thank you.
Okay. We'll start with stormwater funds and other capital funds. Nan.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Nan Newland. I'm the Public Works Director, and I'm happy to be here this morning to talk to you about our capital funds. You have a pie chart in front of you that gives you a snapshot of our infrastructure system and the expenses that are proposed in 2014, which is a total of $33 million. We have about 44% of this is planned to be an investment in our street system, an ongoing investment. 29% is an investment in our stormwater and drainage system, 15% in our water system, and the remaining 15% of the pie is split between sidewalks, parking, major buildings, traffic signals, and streetlight systems. We're going to focus first on our Stormwater Fund. I'm going to give you an overview of that. We're going to bring Stan Balicki, our Assistant Director for Operations, up then to talk about water, and Andy Sikich will follow. Our Assistant Director for Engineering will follow with an overview of our street system. The Stormwater Fund is an enterprise fund. We have budgeted net revenues of $3.68 million, almost exclusively from stormwater fees that are charged to all property owners in the village as part of the stormwater utility. We have budgeted expenses of $12.7 million in 2014, and they will exceed revenue as we continue to spend the proceeds from the 2008 stormwater bond. As I said, the Stormwater Fund is an enterprise fund. It's supported by fees. It contains all expenses related to stormwater management, including maintenance, capital improvements, and debt service. The foundation of the Stormwater Fund is really three things. It really starts with our Stormwater Master Plan, which lays the foundation for an effective and sustainable approach to managing our system. This plan includes recommendations for maintenance of stormwater schedules for our stormwater infrastructure that includes replacing storm sewers that have reached the end of their useful life, cleaning and stabilizing our creeks and channels, maintaining and dredging stormwater storage facilities, and performing system maintenance. The second component of our system is maintaining and operating our system in a way that complies with the Federal Clean Water Act. Not only do we need to manage the runoff and the flow of water, but we need to maintain it in the quality of the water to meet federal standards. And we do this by performing regular system inspections and reports, permitting soil erosion measures for new construction, and constructing water quality improvements to meet the increasing requirements of this act. The third component of this is our capital improvements. And you're all familiar with the WIP, what we created in 2007, 2008. That really created the backbone for our capital projects. We updated this in 2013 as a result of the April flood and the April flood study. And this flood study included recommendations that allow us to continue to improve the system in a way that we can operate the system so that it doesn't negatively impact property owners in the village. We do this by constructing projects that were previously identified in the WIP, as well as those identified in this April flood study. A little bit of background on our system. We have three major watersheds in the village, and they're all defined by the creeks that they drain to. We have Lacey Creek to the north, St. Joseph's Creek in the middle of the village. We have the north and south branch, and we have Prentice Creek to the south. These three creeks add up to a total of over 11 miles of stream banks that make up the backbone of our drainage system. And in addition to these creeks, we have over 128 miles of storm sewers, 7,000 drainage structures, and about 60 miles of ditches throughout the village that we maintain. This is just an example of one of our recent capital projects, capital maintenance projects on St. Joseph's Creek North Branch. I know in previous budget meetings you've seen a lot of the pictures of the condition of the creeks throughout the village. So this is a good news story. This is a recently completed project, one of similar to many that we have upcoming in our system that are needed to be done. You see the before picture on the top and the after picture on the bottom. These poorly constructed retaining walls throughout the village are failing, and they create blockages that lead to reduced flow and inability to carry large flows during floods. By doing these projects, we improve flow and reduce emergency repairs. These are some examples of the types of projects that we are completing right now. Sustainable stormwater projects, green, we also refer to as green stormwater improvement projects. We have the Washington Street Bioretention Cell, also referred to as a rain garden. They provide a place to collect stormwater that would otherwise be nuisance runoff and provide a clean, a place to clean and filter the water. This is also true of the recently completed projects at Fire Station 3. And Grove Street also includes some rain gardens. This is the Grove Street Reconstruction project. This is also Grove Street, a before and after picture. Grove Street had many components to it. It was started off as a street reconstruction. It needed to be reconstructed. We reconstructed with permeable pavers, which allow rainwater to be filtered through the pavement and collected in structures on the edges of the pavement after it's been filtered and slowed down. There's rain gardens along the edge where we bring it all together to help filter it. And then there's mechanical devices. They're called vortex separators, large structures that kind of move the water around, settle out the solids, and collect it in a place that we can come and suck it out. So it's a nice stormwater collection, cleaning, and street reconstruction project. It also provided traffic calming. In summary, the projected revenue for the Stormwater Fund in 2014 is $3.68 million, as I said earlier. And they reflect a recommended 10% increase in the stormwater utility fee, as was recommended in the stormwater utility report. This allows us to reach our recommended maintenance levels. The projected expenses are $12.72 million and reflect a spending down of the fund balance. The major expenses include a debt service payment of $1.14 million, operations and maintenance expenses of $2.03 million, and $9.55 million to complete 25 stormwater and drainage projects. And that's a large number of projects. So what I did was I broke it down in a couple of tables here. There's going to be 4 tables. The first 2 tables show projects that were previously identified in the CIP, in the Capital Community Investment Plan, which is a plan that you've seen in previous budgets. This table includes 3 head wall replacements, storm sewer replacement. This is our annual element, $500,000 for that. We have phase 2 of stream bank stabilization improvements on Lacey Creek and some work on our drain tiles throughout the village. The second table are also previously identified CIP projects. They are a number of improvements to conveyance systems, storm sewers throughout the village, and detention throughout the village. This next table includes projects that were included in the 2013 flood report recommendations. These include new projects as well as projects that were previously in the CIP but that were reprioritized and put in for 2014 because of what we saw in the flood. This is a total of a little bit over $2.1 million for those projects. This is our last group of projects for the 2014 capital projects in stormwater. And these are projects that we began in 2013 or 2012, which we are continuing with monitoring and maintenance for the native plantings. We also have Valley View and Kensington, which were design build projects that we have underway at the moment that will be completed in 2014. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions specific to projects or turn it back to Dave.
Just that, Mayor. We're happy to answer any questions you have.
Well, thank you, Nan. Appreciate the presentation. And obviously, the big story of 2013 was the implementation of the stormwater utility. So why don't we just start with that? And obviously, we've done a great deal of projects with it. There is a recommendation for funding going forward for the stormwater utility. But why don't we break it down and first start off with we had one meeting where we talked about potential tweaks to the way in which the stormwater utility works. Earlier this year, we voted on some changes. Are there any questions or comments on the structure of the utility? Well, I'll ask that question first, and then we'll visit the question of the proposal with respect to fees. So are there any questions with respect to the structure of the utility from members of the council? Commissioner Newstand?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to, first off, thank everybody for coming. And a couple things before we get to stormwater. We're going to have 10 meetings on this budget. And it always makes me think every year what our other municipalities and our other neighbors are doing with their budgets and how many meetings they have. Not to cast a shadow over them, but I think Martin's right. It's usually one, and it's sometimes on their consent agendas. So it's important for me to talk about the stormwater utility today because I think there's 2 things going on. One, how we continue along with the progress of the utility, and 2, the rate that we come up with. There's a recommended rate here in our budget, and then what should we go forward with the rate? That's kind of up to us. The utility, I think, has been working. I think it is a unique way for us to create the Stormwater Fund as to be an enterprise fund that has its own revenues and its own stream of dollars coming in. Nan just told us about 11 miles of creeks and 7,000 structures that we have to maintain and operate. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't get to write down. Stormwater is an issue in Downers Grove, but it's being handled appropriately by this council and the staff. But in order to handle it, we need to have the dollars to do it. I support the utility going forward. I think that the program structure is appropriate. I think where we can start to look at modifying it, and I shouldn't use that word. I told somebody once not to use that word. But the way that we can move forward with the utility is to look at the rate and set the right rate for the future so we can continue to do these projects. We've got 25 projects listed for next year, and that's a lot of projects, and we need to come up with a way to fund them. So we have the utility in place. Let's use it. Let's set an appropriate rate going forward, and I look forward to doing that and having that conversation with my colleagues.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I do want to have a discussion about the proposed increase. But any other questions right now with respect to the structure of the utility itself?
Yeah, I do, Mayor.
Commissioner Barnett?
It should come as no surprise to my colleagues, but it seems like an appropriate time to be talking about it relative to structure. We have made some tweaks both before actually passing the ordinance that created the stormwater utility and of course some more technical ones a few weeks ago. And I would maintain there still are tweaks to be made to the structure itself. As it relates from where I sit to the NFP portion of it, it's probably something that has the potential to be, oh no, here he goes again, which I can respect because it's been a long discussion over 2 decades almost, decade and a half. But there are aspects of the stormwater utility that when we say working are absolutely right. When we look at the goals, as I recall them, of the stormwater utility, which had to do with sustainability of revenue, predictability of revenue, and then, of course, moving those forward to the system itself, as well as a cost shift or a reduction in the burden on our residents of paying for it. Those are all certainly what's happening with the definition of working. Those are, to be sure, those are happening. And those are good things and things that we collectively should be proud of about the utility. But the equity aspect of it is one that I really think is not, in my opinion, is failing. When this model was proposed, it included our parks and school districts. Of course, that evolved, I would argue, primarily from a political nature because of state laws on tax caps. The NFP question is one that has been raised perhaps by a minority, but nonetheless consistently brought out and raised both before and after implementation.
Just for those listening at home, NFP, you mean not-for-profits?
I'm sorry, yes, thank you. But as it relates to the overall scope, I'm going to just sort of build a clock, if you'll permit me. In 2007, the council, which includes, I think, 3 of the current council folks, engaged in a process of trying to really get our arms around flooding in the village. And it was so necessary and such a big step, but one that was really well taken and well thought out. And then we decided to fund that through primarily a bond issuance, which was paid for by property taxes. The reason I bring that up is because I don't want any of this to sound like a commitment or a lack of commitment to stormwater and infrastructure. That is key, and certainly in my tenure, the council, this one and the prior one, have been solidly committed to making sure that we're good stewards of our assets and taking care of them. There's no piece of this discussion that I want interpreted wrong relative to that. But there also becomes an element of science versus politics, for lack of a better word, the body politic, if you will. The science said we had, I don't remember how many items were on the list, 200 of them or something, and $350 million in 2007. Clearly, we made decisions going forward about how to tackle that were not pure science. And as you can see in the numbers that were up, I'm sorry about, don't bring the slide back, but we have this $12 million that we're proposing to spend in 2014, of which a huge portion, whatever the $12 million minus 3.68 is, that's still bond issuances from '08. And if we think back to the original sort of planning, we were talking about periodic $25 million bond issuances. That didn't happen. I'm not critical of that, but I'm using it to highlight the fact that this is not necessarily science. If we did $12.7 million in 2014 and instead removed the 8% NFPs and did $12.3 million in 2014, I think it'd be awfully hard to suggest that there was some sort of a failure on our part to be serious about the long-term health of our stormwater system, that we were somehow not really focused or somehow diminishing the commitment to long-term care of our assets. It really isn't a question for me about the technical nature of the stormwater utility or the technical nature of the systems that we're trying to support or the commitment to long-term protection of those systems. It's a question about how we fund the things we do. This is a huge change in the project started in 2007. We did that first part with bonds, pure straight debt. We did sort of the second part in the long-term continuation with utility, and that's fair. But in that first investment, our not-for-profits were exempt. They weren't part of that $25 million commitment. The $12.5 million we're spending this year, $9.5 million of it, they were not part of. That we thought that was appropriate at the time. We think that is appropriate for everything else we're doing. And I know there'll be some that say, well, what about water? Of course, there's one difference, which is that's the one thing that folks can use and have some true control over how much they pay. It's a big difference compared to any of the other revenues we raise and any of the services that we provide. We talk about equity, and we go, and I just still have this problem. We went and started instantly removing people from, for reasons that I guess every one of us will have their own, but it was certainly political from where I sat. But further to that, property taxes, which fund everything else that we do, couldn't be less equitable. It is the least equitable, most progressive tax that is out there. There is nobody here that can make an argument that a $250,000 home consumes more resources of our police, our fire, our public works than does a $2.5 million home. It is absolutely the most inequitable progressive tax that's levied. And we do it every day for $44 million of our operating. And this small amount, it seems like a small amount because it's what, $300,000, 8.7% is $320, something like that, out of a $3.5 million annual fee that's supposed to end up a $6.5 million annual fee. But it's a philosophical, structural thing about the village that I really think is a failing on our part. Now, I may not convince anybody this morning, but the net effect, as I see it, on the utility itself is a question that we can decide from a policy standpoint, which is how fast are we going to get to our desired outcome, which if you made a change instead of 15 years, maybe it's 17 years. Or what rates are we going to charge our residents who are picking up the rest of the tab? And that amount is a very, very small amount. That $200-some thousand, which is a huge thing in structure and philosophy to me, is a very small amount on an individual residence. Those shifts, we've seen the pie charts, those shifts in the percent and split, how much of the stormwater work our residents are paying pre versus post utility, remain largely intact if this 8% is back out. They still see a net reduction. And we talked about lots of things relative to this fairness thing, and I can't find an argument that holds beyond this one sort of narrow scope of what we're doing, and it's way different than the way we started it. So I'd like us to at least consider, I'm trying not to be self-defeatist, except obviously we've had this discussion more than once, and I think I know where my colleagues lie, but I'd like us to seriously consider and seriously model what that looks like if we take that 8% out.
Looks like it's being modeled right behind you.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys doing this. Obviously, I'd mentioned this to Dave before.
I just whipped this up on the
Part of what we're talking about here is you have, Dave's going to keep taking it away from you.
sorry.
It's a good move. These parts here, guys, are not something that I'm questioning, and I want to underscore that. The debt service and O&M obviously has to be part of where our solid commitment is. We don't want to end up with what we saw, that we were trying to recover from streets, we were trying to recover from stormwater for decades of essentially neglect. But these parts up here, the capital that we do, is back to this, how much do we need to do it and how fast do we need to do it? And that's what I'm suggesting is negligibly impacted by moving back to a structure that's more consistent with everything else we fund in the village. So there's my spiel. I'd love to hear you guys talk some more about it, because I'm still struggling with, it seems like a pretty surface level discussion that we've had to this point about the definitions of fairness and how we want everybody to pay their fair share, because there's lots of pieces of that argument that have big holes, gaping holes on them from where I sit. So I'm done. Thank you for doing this, Dave. If Dave wants to go through this,
Yeah, just
probably to explain a little more.
Bob not only went into structure discussions, but also how did we recommend the rate that you see in the budget, which is a 10% increase. We would take the rate from $8.40 per unit to $9.24 per unit. What you have here is a graph with years 2013 through 2016 across the bottom, and millions of dollars in investment there on the left, ranging from 5 up to 15. The bar graphs in blue are the dollars that we need to spend to meet the stormwater standards that Nan just explained, the Clean Water Act, the Stormwater Master Plan, our investment plan. These are the dollars that we need to spend to meet the standards to have a fully functioning system. You can see those blue numbers start at 5.6 million in 2013 and ramp up to 7.5 in 2016. Then they begin to level off a little bit, but continue on increasing after that. The red are the dollars generated from the stormwater utility fees that we will have and are planned to be spent in the next several years. What you can obviously see is the gap between what we need to be spending to meet standards and the money we have available, even with the increasing stormwater fees as shown on the board. We knew that when we created the stormwater utility. We made a general policy direction that said in 15 years, over a 15-year period, that's when those two bar graphs would meet, and we would become fully funded and sustainable in 2028. So that is the basis for the recommendation of the 10% increase. And a couple of things happened since we came up with this plan that originally appeared in the Stormwater Utility Report. And that is, there continues to be upward pressure on the blue bar graphs. We learned a lot from the 2013 flood. We learned that there are more projects that we could and maybe should be doing, and so that blue number wants to go higher. And we've also heard from some of our members of our community, some of them are here today, talking about the impacts of the fees that are represented in these total revenue numbers in red. And there's pressures to keep those as low as possible. And that tension is really the policy issue that's in front of you. How quickly do we take this red and get it to the blue, and who pays? So we are recommending a fee increase of from $8.40 to $9.24. We'll raise our revenues by about $200,000, and we'll continue to invest in our system.
Thank you, Dave. Well, again, I think it makes sense to focus on the structure of the utility before we get into staff's recommendation for the increase, which assumes that we preserve the existing structure of the utility. So I suggest that we go back to the structure question and the specific request for consideration that Commissioner Barnett's put on the table, which is, just to sum it up, to exclude tax-exempt properties from the utility, which would represent, I think currently represents about 8.7% of the revenue stream for the entire utility. Questions, thoughts, comments from other members of the council on that subject?
Can I ask a question, Mayor?
Of course you can.
One of the things that I'm unclear about, and Enza, maybe you could help on this question. I think the utility, my personal opinion on the utility is that we need. It's new. Let's continue going forward, experimenting with this model, and then continually every year reevaluating where we're at, how it's working for our community. But I certainly don't want to undermine the utility's legal basis, the legal standing of the utility. So I just want to be clear. The concept of exempting not-for-profits. I have some question. Would that be something we could do and still preserve the legal structure of the utility, as a utility versus the previous paid for stormwater through property tax? So could we exempt the not-for-profits and still maintain the utility that we have now? I guess is my question.
To the extent that it calls for legal advice, I'll suggest that perhaps that be, the village attorney can answer that either now or at a future point in time.
Yeah, I mean, we could, the simple answer is yes. However, there's more that goes into that, and, you know, we can go into that further at a different time. It's more of a matter of how to distinguish between the not-for-profits, how to clarify in between, there's some not-for-profits that are churches, there are other types of not-for-profits, and how we do that logistically and things like that. It's a little more in-depth than just yes.
And some of the depth that Enzo was talking about is included in this memo that we put in your packets, was published on September 13th, just a few weeks ago. And the bottom line, just to sum up what Enzo was saying, is yes, we have the ability to set the fees in whatever manner we want, including zero fees for certain land use categories. The issue is how does that affect the desired outcomes going forward? And you see a couple of bullet points and some explanations. For those of you who don't have this in front of you, there's copies in the back table. It's a report that's at the end of the written question and responses.
One of the reasons I asked for some of that stuff that's in that report Dave's referring to is to help answer that question, David. And oversimplified, it's a matter of treating like entities in like fashion. And so, as a big what if you had a federal 401c3 exemption, you therefore would be exempt. And then you would have to treat everybody that fell into that category exactly the same. But you can make those kinds of choices in how we structure the utility.
And I think at certain points when we were just simply discussing the churches, at least in my mind, I thought if you exempted the churches, then the next people in line would be the non-for-profits would say, why don't we get treated the same? So I think by including them all in your concept is to not affect the legal structure.
And the 8 point, whatever it is, 7 or 4, I think, and help me, that is essentially everybody that we believe would qualify as an NFP. That is not church only, right?
The 8.77%.
Property that'd be subject to the fee. The problem is there are not-for-profits in town that don't own the property and therefore would not benefit from an exemption.
Sure.
Right, so the 8.77% is only property owners that are property tax exempt as defined in our database.
Right, so for example, if a not-for-profit leased a property, they wouldn't benefit from being excluded.
Right.
They would be treated differently.
Mayor, could I just
Sorry, go back.
continue my line on the, I appreciate that and appreciate Commissioner Burnett that clarification. At this point for me, I'm in favor of continuing the utility. I'm in favor of continuing the utility in its current form as we continue to evaluate its impact on our community and its ability to achieve these outcomes that have been set by the prior council, and thus, and I'll get into the fee once we get to that point as well. But I think that it's important that we show a commitment to this structure moving forward, but also show a commitment that we are cognizant of the financial burden that this does place on our property owners, all property owners within the village in setting the fee. So that's where I'm at. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Jose?
Thank you, Mayor. Dave, just for a bit of background, when the utility was first proposed by staff, and I'm blanking on the date, it was April, I forget the year, it didn't include the $1.1 million for debt service, did it?
Just a couple of points. The discussion and the concept of the utility actually originated at the council level back in 2001 or so. And by the time we actually got around
Way
to
to shift blame, Dave.
I think it's important to note that because it was a decade in the making before we got to the point, which is what you were asking about. And in that 10 years, we did all the planning documents necessary to have this discussion. The first round of recommendations and analysis came out that said the existing bond issuance from 2008 could continue to be paid for from other revenues, including property tax and a portion of home rule sales tax, I believe. In the discussion at the preliminary stages of actually creating the utility, there was direction given to take all of the stormwater-related costs and put them under this utility concept and be subject to the fee, and all the fee revenues would pay for all components, debt service, capital, and maintenance.
And by including that 1.1 million in debt service payments in the utility, that would, of course, drive the fee up.
Yes.
Just a little bit of history there. I'm with Commissioner Olson on this. I think we need to continue the structure as it is. That being said, we do have incentive programs, we do have credit programs, and I hope that not-for-profits and all our residents do everything they can to take advantage of those programs. There's a reason we put them there. We hope that folks will take those steps to mitigate the amount of stormwater that comes off of their properties. And if we find that those programs are maxed out and there are ways that we can enhance them, I hope we do that. And I'd like to see additional ways that we can work with folks moving forward to make sure that they take those steps so that we have less stormwater going into the system, which then makes our system that much more useful. So that's where I am moving forward, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other questions or comments on the structure of the utility?
I kind of did.
Mr. Rankin?
So when you're saying, Commissioner Barnett, when you're saying take that 300,000 out, are you saying to affect the fees, that the fees would not increase for residents and just maybe we do less projects? Is that what you're trying to say?
It, of course, weaves into the next subject a little bit, but my preference in the moment is to just remove that amount. As opposed to take 300 out and reallocate it over the rest of the residential properties and commercial properties, I would like to just take it out. If you look at these and start stacking the red line, this goal also has, the blue also has to be stacked. But the fact is, we're still burning that bond money. And so the 10-year picture, this is shorter than that, but the 10-year picture minus 300,000 doesn't, in my opinion, appreciably move us any farther away from that 2028 goal of having all blue stacks. It's a question, Greg alluded to the change that I think I had a lot to do with moving the debt service into it. And I mentioned that in my original comments, and that is absolutely true. It again goes to this structural question. For me, and I don't mean to be dismissive of Nan's team, for me the question is less about is this exactly 3.5 or 3.7 or 4 million or 5.9 over here? Because the fact is that it's $3.5 million more than we had in 2012. Going forward at some increasing rate. So there's a big new commitment to putting money into stormwater, irrespective of what happens with the 8% of the entities. And so just like that question about moving debt service, for me it's a structural question. What do we, when we're all dead and gone, or at least off this council, what do we want the structure of the thing to look like? And that's why a non-mixed stream, if you will, I thought was important, so there was clarity on how it was serviced. And the same is true for this piece.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate you asking the question, Commissioner, and obviously this is something that is appropriate to address, although I would want to even take it back a little bit further. And there's a couple things I don't think anybody disputes, and that is that the village has significant stormwater needs. Nobody disputes that. And those needs stem from both our obligation to manage and invest in stormwater infrastructure, but also, as Nan mentioned, we have the unfunded mandate of the Federal Clean Water Act, which requires us to do things and yet provides us no funding to do it with. We have to do it. And there's no dispute that those obligations and needs are very expensive. And these obligations and needs also stem from the fact that we want to provide service to our community and try to address community-wide flooding issues as best we can. I think we were acutely aware of that, as Dave Fieldman mentioned, during the April extraordinary flooding event that we had. And there's no question the entire community is calling upon us, tax-exempt and non-tax-exempt, to address that issue. Because flooding doesn't respect tax IRS boundaries and definitions. So the question has always been not whether we do these things, and I think that Commissioner Barnett, you pointed that out. Nobody's disputing that we have a lot of projects to do, and they're very expensive. We need to address them. The question is, what's the best method by which to fund them? And this has been a long discussion, and I would want to remind everyone that we had this discussion years ago. I distinctly recall this being a topic of conversation when the concept of utility was originally addressed. This has been a conversation that's been going on for 10 years before it was implemented. We looked at a needs study, we looked at a feasibility study. We spent at least a year, if not more, reaching out to the public and the not-for-profits included and had this very conversation. I kind of wish we had had this conversation back then, not 9 months into the utility. But that's fine. Here we are, and it's been implemented. And we can continue to discuss it because it is something new, and as adjustments are appropriate, of course, we're going to make them. But conceptually, I think this is a vastly superior way of funding stormwater from what is the most inequitable funding source on the planet, which are property taxes, because there's absolutely no relationship between stormwater runoff and the value of a property. And I would hesitate to stay with that instead of move to something that is more logical and something that makes more sense, and more importantly, something we control. Sales tax we can't do much about. Income tax we can't do much about. Property tax, sure, we can levy it and we get a certain dollar amount. We can control that. There's a fair amount of control here too, and particularly with the specter of Springfield, I think the more self-reliant we can be and the more control we have over our revenue streams, the better, because that helps lead to our sustained financial stability, which we all know is very important because it allows us things like a AAA bond rating. A AAA bond rating that recently resulted in $500,000 worth of savings because of a refinancing of a debt obligation. So I'm also uniquely aware of the fact that having these types of sustainable and confirmed commitments to revenue streams and our investment in infrastructure are very important in keeping our financial rating in a place where we can continue to achieve those kind of successes. And that's just the most recent one. I mean, there are obviously other benefits that will be paid to that. So I think we need to pay attention to that as well. And I'm not suggesting anybody here is disagreeing with that. The reason why this makes sense is because all properties commit or contribute to stormwater runoff. All properties do. And the concept of a fee is to allocate an expense in some rough measure, and no, it's not perfect. We don't go out there with an eyedropper and measure runoff from every blade of grass. We can't do that. That's administratively prohibitive. So we use a proxy to try to come up with some measure of how much a runoff a property generates, and then we charge a fee based on that. And that's part of the equation, and it has a much more direct impact. The benefit of that, among having a better relationship and shifting the burden in the sense that it spreads it out, and it spreads it out, in my opinion, in a much fairer way than it was before. I think before utility, single-family residential properties were contributing about 46%, maybe 50% of the runoff that we were responsible for managing, and yet we're paying over 75% of the cost for doing it. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. You ask any residential property owner why that is the case, and they would come back to you and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. That should be changed. Well, we've changed that. We also changed it by adding more payers. That helps drive the additional revenue, because there were properties that previously were paying nothing and then now are contributing to the cost of managing stormwater runoff. But the flip side of that is the partnerships and the credits that are available. And I know Commissioner Jose touched upon that. Unlike property taxes, which if you try to reduce your property taxes, there's a long drawn-out process. You go to the township assessor and try to reduce what your property taxes are. But we actually have built into the system the ability to get credits and reductions in the fee to ameliorate the impact upon a property owner. And that's not just designed to ameliorate the impact, but it also encourages responsibility in the management of one's property, consistent with the overall goals of the Stormwater Management Program, which is to manage stormwater properly, have awareness, best practices, contribute to compliance with the Clean Water Act. And that's a great benefit from this structure, that exempting someone from having to contribute, you kind of lose that benefit. So I'm also sensitive to that. I understand the point about how some people have been excluded. I would disagree that it was politics. I would say it was more partnership, and that's what I would like to focus on, rather than excluding people and arguing that that's more politics. Let's talk about how we can partner and how we can come up with maybe making sure that not-for-profits that are feeling the burden are truly coming forward and engaging and taking advantage of all the credits. I'm not so sure that's been the case. I think we've had some not-for-profits come to us and either engage in partnership credits or other types of exemptions by doing something that contributes to the overall goals of the stormwater management plan. There's a lot who haven't, and I would like to first see full engagement on that respect before we talk about categorically excluding properties. And the problem is, if we're talking about tax-exempt organizations, I still have a problem with the only ones that would benefit would be those who own property and are subject to the fee. You have those categories of not-for-profits that might be leasing property, and they're still going to end up paying the fee unless we now exempt commercial properties.
That's like an income tax reduction for those that aren't paying income tax, Martin. Of course, those folks are also not paying the fee. So it's not that they don't get a reduction, they are also not paying on the front end either.
Well, maybe.
Unless their landlord.
Right, and we don't have
passes it.
control about that. If the landlord passes it
Right.
through as part of their lease, and they are paying the fee.
That's different than property tax how?
Well, right, but I'm talking about the fee right now, and there's a built-in
And the
disparity.
credit thing is a maximum of 50% anywhere, so even if everybody took advantage of it, which of course they're not, it's like a lifetime warranty on a muffler, you're betting nobody's gonna take it. This whole thing was to generate an additional $6.5 to $7 million of revenue. That was not gonna be accomplished by everybody getting out and putting in pavers and rain barrels and pulling the rates down to 50%.
Right.
Nonsense. It was accounting on most folks not doing it.
Well,
Well, it's the math.
I-
And if everybody took their 50% reduction, what would we be talking about for an increase? It's planning on people not doing it, which we saw in aggregation, the same thing. For a decade, you could aggregate your electricity in town, and people didn't until we collectively did it for them.
Well, I think it's more of a recognition that regardless of how many steps you take to mitigate the amount of stormwater that comes off your property, there's going to be stormwater that comes off your property. You're going to have an effect on the system one way or the other. So there needs to be a certain base level of fee that you pay, even with regard to taking into account the steps that you've taken that you've earned a credit or an incentive for.
How does that differ from any of the other services we provide? Regardless of what steps you take, you're going to have need for our public services.
well, I mean, but the point is, again, two wrongs don't make a right. And I don't see, well, because we treat other things using the most inequitable funding source on the planet, well, let's stay with that because it's the most inequitable funding source on the planet. That just, to me, defies logic. We have a model for this. It's called our water fund. And nobody's suggesting that we exempt not-for-profits from the water fund.
They control their usage, though, Mark.
Well, and to the extent they can, that's my point. To the extent there's an ability to control your usage here by managing your runoff. This goes back to the awareness of the problem, managing stormwater in the best practice. The next time there's a construction project of maybe a parking lot, they might use permeable pavers, like the example we looked at earlier. We want to keep that awareness and keep that incentive there. There are opportunities for credits, and yes, we built in certain things in the budget. It was a one-year program. We budgeted a certain amount because we made our best projection of who was going to use it and how much was going to use it. Of course, not everybody uses it. Not everybody even uses their tax deductions. The IRS counts on that as well. It's a fact of life. The point is that there are opportunities for additional credits that from those that we're hearing from haven't even engaged fully with respect to the credits are available. I would like to see that. Here's what I'm trying to say. I would like to see the structure itself work to the best that it possibly can before we talk about changing the structure. Because it's kind of like trying to open a lock, pick a lock with a bazooka, in my opinion. I think this is categorically.
With a bazooka?
All right.
Come
maybe
on, man. It's a better conversation than pick a lock with a bazooka. We're talking about
Hold on a second.
$300,000
Hold on
out
a
of
second.
$3.6 million
Yeah,
annually.
well, we're talking about $300,000, and that number increases over the 15 or 20 years of this program, by the way.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is, I understand what the request is. We had this conversation years ago. I kind of wish we'd had this conversation and finalized it 2 years ago instead of 9 months into the program.
Yeah, but
here we
these were
are.
thoughts that came up after the program and the public came before us,
I
Mayor.
disagree with that.
Well,
These
I
thoughts were
totally
just-
disagree with you.
Commissioner, I was at the meetings when we sat down with the not-for-profits and explained this program to them 2 years ago.
Okay. I'm talking about the council meetings that we discussed this at.
But the
And I'm the
po-
one who brought it up and said this was an area that I did not think of or reflect upon when I voted in favor of the stormwater utility fee.
Well, and that may be very well the case. You didn't reflect upon it at the time. But my point is,
Correct.
there was public outreach. There were meetings specifically with not-for-profit organizations long time ago. And we talked through this, and yes, I get it. There is a segment of the community that is now paying something they didn't previously pay for. I understand and fully appreciate that if I were in their shoes, I would prefer not to pay something that I wasn't paying in the past. All I'm saying is that the structure is working. I think we ought to continue with the structure. And instead, we should focus on if there's a particular segment. And by the way, we're not hearing from all the tax-exempt organizations. We're hearing from some tax-exempt organizations. So we should treat this with a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Let's, first of all, make sure that we're taking advantage of all the credits and reductions that are available in the existing system. I'm not convinced that's happened.
It's not. We know
Exactly.
we know it's not.
But it can. And if it isn't, why not? Let's address that first. Second, are there options for additional ways to minimize or ameliorate the impact upon those property owners that are the ones that are saying that this is impacting them adversely? And by the way, it's not all tax-exempt organizations that we're hearing from. So once again, I think it's overkill to categorically take out all of them. Let's focus on the ones that are actually raising their voices. Let's first of all make sure that they're taking full advantage of the credits and reductions that are available in the system. I'm not convinced that's the case. Second of all, let's look at other opportunities to create other partnership opportunities or other types of credits that might assist in that way. And then let's also look at maybe other ways that the village can be of assistance in facilitating the achievement of their mission in the most financially advantageous way. For example, I get requests almost on a daily basis to waive fees for not-for-profits, for building permits, all kinds of permits. We routinely waive those fees.
Yeah.
There are opportunities to get to the bottom line.
Routinely waive those fees, don't we? Yeah.
For those things we do. That's
Why?
right.
You still have to do an inspection. Why would we waive the fee?
Well, because that's one of the ways that we
How
help.
much money are we losing?
Well, that's $10,000. It's not $300,000. What you're asking for is basically a waiver of $300,000. By the way,
I'm not saying I support
I
what
didn't
Bob's
say,
saying.
I didn't say you.
You're looking at me.
I'll move over so you guys don't get hit by lightning.
I wasn't saying you.
Okay.
My point of that is that I think we ought to, third, look at other ways if we can try to assist in ameliorating the impact of the burden. That's what we ought to focus on. I'm very reluctant to change the overall structure of an entire program that's working very well and will continue to work very well to help us achieve goals like a AAA bond rating.
Those are,
Without-
everything you said I agree with, Martin.
Hold on a second, I'm almost done.
I really do.
I know you do. That's all I'm saying. So my answer to the question is, I understand the motivation for the request. I would like to try to address the root of the problem in a different and more focused surgical way than categorically exempting almost 9% of the entire program.
The only thing I guess I would suggest is that I can't say I agree with everything because the bazooka thing threw me, but
I just want to make sure you're awake.
It threw you, huh?
But
I think it blasted you.
the thing is that what you're talking about,
Cremated you.
you bring up great examples of exactly how we are doing this. And that's the thing when you say, I don't want to change the whole program. I don't either. I tried to make that real clear when I started in. I don't want to change most of the program. I want to change 8% of the program. And I want to change 8% of the program to make it consistent with the way we run the village in every other facet of what we do.
Almost every other facet.
Except for water, where they can control their outcome. This control the outcome thing on this thing, we've been saying for 18 months now, we'll listen, we'll tweak, we're open to changes, we want to try and be helpful. What have we done yet?
We adopted some revisions about a month ago.
That
gonna
help, that
talk
help the
about-
not-for-profits ameliorate their impact?
Well, you didn't add that adjective.
That's what, but that's.
Qualifier was missing from your statement.
Okay, those are the words that almost everybody here, I can't say that for sure, but my recollection is almost everybody sat and said when we've been approached 2, 3, 4 times over the last, since the implementation, that we would want to work with you, we want to work with you, we want to do some things, we want to be helpful, we're willing to make tweaks, I think was the word that was used quite a bit to this thing. And I haven't heard anybody from this group suggest what those might be, nor have I heard anybody suggest that there are any.
I disagree. Actually, I think the comment was we'd be willing to consider tweaks. First,
Another qualifier that was missing?
yes, yes, an important one. First, take full advantage of the existing credits and reductions that are available in the program. I know for a fact those are not being taken advantage of, nor have they even been requested in many instances. Why not? Let's start with what's there. Let's start with the low-hanging fruit. That's one category of working with those who are voicing concerns about the impact. Was willing then, willing now, and continue to be willing to work with them to figure out.
Can we go seek them?
How, sure.
Seek them out? I mean, can we make that part of what we talk about
Absolutely.
budgeting for when we're talking about resources in 2014, that we're going to, as part of the rollout of this thing or evolution, we're going to go
Yes.
find them and help them?
Sure. Well, I think
'Cause it-
I think
'cause it is like-
I think they're coming to our meetings, so it's not too hard to find them.
No, a few of them are, but it is like your tax, you made the point about the property taxes.
But
That's
here's
exactly
the
right.
thing.
It's a pain in the
Those deductions, those credits are already built into the budget, so we can do that operating within what's already there. So I think first and foremost, we need to work with the organizations to make sure they're taking full advantage of the credits that are already available to them. And we don't have to change a thing, because it's already built into the budget. As you pointed out, it's not being taken advantage of, and yet it's already in the budget.
So can we?
There's no change that needs to be taken in
Can
order
we
to
in
accomplish that.
2014 direct our crew to be part of what they're planning for resource usage?
Absolutely. In
Go
2012,
spend-
we had public meetings. Staff
No,
went
that's
out.
not what I mean. I don't mean a public meeting that we have typically is, we're gonna have a meeting on this subject, invite everybody. I mean, call up all these NFPs that are property tax owners, we've got them, it's a discrete list, and say, we wanna come meet with you
I think staff would
to
tell you that
help-
that's already happened.
to help you
but yes,
figure
we
out
can do
what
it
you're
again.
gonna apply for and help you do it.
Absolutely.
'Cause it's not
Absolutely.
happening, and I think it's not happening because just like property taxes, just like aggregation, just like all the other things that are available to any individual property owner, they're seldom used because they're a pain.
That is a foregone conclusion.
They're seldom used. That's not a foregone conclusion.
No, the foregone conclusion that we would be willing to reach out as we have before and continue to reach out and try to encourage people to take full advantage of the credits that already exist in the system. That's the first way that I think we have committed to working with those not-for-profits that have brought this to our attention. And again, I want to emphasize, it's not everybody. And so that's why I'm reluctant to take everybody out when, let's focus on those who are voicing this as a concern. Second, I don't think, the other thing that we said we would do is consider additional opportunities for credits and incentives. I know there's been some work done about exploring possible incentives and credits that aren't currently in the program, but that could ameliorate the impact on certain organizations that didn't previously contribute to managing stormwater costs. Maybe not eliminate them, but ameliorate that impact. I continue to be, and I think all of us continue to be, open to exploring what those are. So yes, we continue to do that. And then, now I forgot what my third point was. There always has to be three, but at least let's start with those two. And so when the statement was made at meetings, yes, we're going to continue to work with you, at least those two things were always on the table. Obviously, the third one, here it is, which we'll get to in a moment, is, okay, going forward, what is the actual fee going to be? And we're going to have that discussion in a moment, and we'll see where that goes. We'll see what the thoughts of the council are. But my preference would be to start from the most narrow, limited, it's the principle of Occam's razor in logic. Go with that approach first before doing something that's more categorical.
Occam's razor doesn't come into the conversation very often, so I'm going to jump in there because I know about it.
Thank God for that.
I think what
That's a good thing.
we're talking about here is
Especially since Commissioner hasn't shaved this morning, so Occam's razor didn't come
did
in.
not. Thanks for reminding me. It was dark when I left the house. I think what we're hearing here is that there is support to kind of continue the stormwater utility as the program is designed now. To Commissioner Barnett's question and comment about the tweaks and the opportunities to change, a couple of things we've heard, and one of the things we've heard today is to seek out NFPs. I think that's a great idea. Obviously, continuing with the credits and incentives that are already part of the program and trying to help our customers, both not-for-profits and residents and commercial users, understand and figure out how those may apply to them. One of the specific items that we did hear from some of our folks was the application fee and how does that play into the process and some of the other fees that are out there. Now, those are things, while they may be small in scope, it does add to a benefit for our staff to help the applicants and our customers. I think, we all know where we kind of stand. I think we all have an idea of where that is. The question for me now is where the rates go. And I just literally thought of an idea and I wrote it down to share with Commissioner Rankin. It's something that I haven't come up with before, so Dave, I'm glad you're sitting down, but it's maybe a compromise. It's something to talk about as we get into the rate conversation. I hope we can maybe shift into that conversation, but what if the not-for-profits, as defined by the property tax exempt code, if you will, what if those folks have a flat rate going forward? They're part of the program, but they are exempt from an increase, or they are not part of the increases going forward. I know we do have that discrete list. They're still in there. They're still contributing to the program. They're still seeing the benefit of stormwater that we all see. Obviously, we would still encourage them to participate and have best management practices. We would encourage them to be part of the credits and incentives, but it still allows us to work with them in some way. I don't even know if there's support for that from our council. I literally just thought of it today, but I think that gets us jumping into the rate conversation.
Well, let's jump into the rate conversation, because I think we've discussed the structure extensively and appreciate the.
I got one more thing.
Please,
It's not,
absolutely.
I won't continue that conversation. Another thing that came to me as I was trying to prepare for this meeting, and I don't need to discuss it today, but I'd like to just mention it to you guys that maybe we could get some more thoughtful response than me. When we charge our school districts, and I'm talking particularly 99, we have charged them, I think, for certain permitting things. We have exempted in some instances, and then I know when we did the, was it Prince
Street vacation.
vacation, we kind of came around to a compromise position there that was trying to reflect the value of Prince Street to Downers' residents as compared to the sort of paying base of operating 99. I think we roughly split it with them because they have like approximately 50% of their area outside of our village. So I guess I'd like to hear you guys comment on that sometime, but over the next, month or next 9 meetings or whatever, in a similar fashion to this equitable aspect of it. They're a partner, and we've established that already. But in other instances, we've suggested that they're still responsible for half of what's going on.
Okay, we can do that.
Well, that actually may be a topic of a broader conversation,
Yes.
another subject. a little
That's
bit
why I
later.
didn't want to, I just want to get it into the, let me get
Yeah,
it.
I think there's more to be said on that. Back to the structure before we go to fees? Or do we want to start? Or is
Well,
this,
I wanted to just tail onto what he was saying, that if,
let's talk about fees. Let's talk about the fee then.
but
Unless
do you
there's any
want to
more
give the churches that are here an opportunity to speak now, or do you want us to speak about the fees and then
Yes, the latter.
the latter?
I thought we would continue the conversation about the fee, because there might be people here that are about the fee and not about the structure.
Sure.
And so let's have that whole conversation, and then anybody who wants to speak about the utility at all, we'll allow an opportunity for conversation.
Okay,
Because I think it probably would be wise to hear the whole thing together.
sure.
So we can,
All right, let's go. Let's do fees.
all right, so is there anybody else want to change the structure besides Commissioner Barnett? I didn't hear anybody else suggest that they wanted to change the structure.
6,
Not this
come on,
morning.
I got
All right.
nothing?
Then let's go to the proposal by staff to have an increase effective in 2014 at the 10% level, which in dollars means instead of $8.40 per ERU, it would be $9.24 per ERU. And if obviously, depending on how many ERUs you have, you multiply that by the fee, and that's what you end up paying every other month.
Typical house impact, if you're in Tier 2 of the residential tiers, is about $10 a year increase.
Right. And just to put it in context, if I have this correct, if the utility had been in place in 2012, a typical house with a market value of $300,000 would have paid about $100 a year in a stormwater utility fee, but that would have been offset for that year by a corresponding reduction in property taxes of about $111, if I have that right.
Correct.
And so obviously, we don't have this year's full experience yet, but my understanding is that we're pretty much tracking that almost to the penny.
Correct.
So for that typical, people always ask, what would the typical house be paying? That's basically what the typical house would have paid, and then would have had that offset with a corresponding reduction in property tax. So comments about the fee. Commissioner Neustadt started off with proposing maybe but I think you probably have broader comments
I
on the
do, and I
fee
have one
than.
more question, actually, if
So,
that's all right.
go ahead.
What is the recommended percentage level for just the operations and maintenance going forward? Is it like 6%, or am I saying that wrong? I think
Yeah,
you know
they-
my question, but I don't,
Debt service and.
Right.
that's servicing.
When the MFSG report came out, which was the study upon which we based the utility, there was a 15-year ramp-up period to get to a fully funded position, which resulted in about an 11% per year increase in the fees to get from here to there in 15 years. After that study came out, we made the policy decision to include debt service payments. Right, so the revenue, what we're trying to achieve, got bigger, and then the fee increased, right, to cover that $1.14 million in debt service. If you were to do an apples-to-apples comparison, the recommendation from MFSG, it translates to about 6.4% a year on the larger base now, right? This staff recommendation in here is at 10%. What we're trying to reflect there is where I talked about the pressures on the blue line, the standards which we have to meet going up. That reflects the 2013 flood experience That flood report, we have doubled the amount of recommended capital projects, right? And so what we're trying to do is put on the table for discussion a fee that is consistent with the MFSG plan, 6.4%, and starts to address the upward pressure on that blue line by doubling the amount of capital projects. It is definitely more art than science at this point. We do not have full dollar amounts on all 20 of those projects. We have money in this year's budget to study those projects. But clearly, the needs were at least 3.6% and likely to be significantly higher than that.
So from my perspective, the needs are at 6.4, and then the above and beyond with this year's current flood report would add on to that. So any additional percentages after 6.4 would be sort of set towards that extra 22-ish projects that we don't have, that we have identified but aren't in this 6.4%.
That's correct. One final point on this. Because we're in a position where we have bond proceeds and fund balance, it was important to staff to recommend that we do some of the projects that we learned about and recommended based on the April flood. That's why Nan walked us through there. So if you increase the fee at 6.4% only, we still do some of the projects that came out of the April experience, and we study some more. But we would eventually have to sort of either reprioritize all the projects in one pot if we're going to compete for the same dollars, or the council would direct us to increase the fee at a rate greater than MFSG recommended to address it. And that's why we're sitting here today, to look for policy direction on where to go in year one of the increase.
Last point, I think, I want to hear what everybody else has to say, but I think something that they've just said about the whole pot of all the projects is interesting to me, to try to maybe reprioritize or take a look at what we experienced this year plus what we have experienced in the past, and maybe if they line up or if there's some synergy between some projects. The comment that Commissioner Barnett made about the ramp up or the rollout 15 to 17 year outliers, which were only up to 2016, which seems like a really far way away, but it's not, on our table here. I think if we can use the experience of this first year and get a couple more months under our belt, a 10% raise is a little bit on the high end for me. I think I would fall somewhere between the 6.4 and maybe a 9% raise in the rate. But of course, I want to hear what the rest of my colleagues have to say and see where we are with that. But I do feel like in order to keep the utility moving forward, there does have to be an increase so we can continue to maintain and operate the infrastructure that we have just put in this year, that we put in starting in '08. Otherwise, we'll fall back into what we call the roadway condition project and problem, which is roads going in, but no dollars being put into the fund to maintain them. It'll be fast to tell us that as soon as it's laid, as soon as the first car drives over, it's like a used car and it gets depreciated pretty quick. So I think there has to be some dollars put in for the operations and maintenance to continue the stormwater fund to not have that problem like we had maybe in our previous roadway funds and road CIP opportunities.
Right, and while everyone's noodling on that, I think it bears repeating that the way this is structured is we're looking at our estimated costs for maintaining and making investments in stormwater infrastructure, and then we're backing into that what dollars will need to be raised over time in order to pay for those needs. This isn't, oh gee, we decide that we want to do more things, so let's just make these increases or anything like that. The increases are driven by the projects that we actually want to accomplish. And so when we accomplish them and how many projects we accomplish are all the direct drivers of what the cost is. And there's a lot of room to play around with this, but to your point, making a change now or next year or the year after that, you're operating within the overall scheme of what do we want to do and what is it going to cost based on these estimates. And we don't know beyond, we certainly can't say what 2028 is going to cost us other than the best estimate. But that's truly what's nice about an enterprise fund, is you look at what your costs are and then you back that into what the pay into the system is. It's just like the water fund. There's a cost to paying for water and transmitting that water to customers. Staff estimates what those costs are. Unfortunately, we don't get to actually control the cost of the water. That's dictated to us by someone for the east, unfortunately. But we do manage our pipes and our water towers and things like that, and we know what those cost, and we figure out what those costs are going to be, and then we back that into the cost of water. It's as simple as that. The nice part about it is you can see what goes in, you can see what the projects are, and you can almost follow those dollars to the penny from the input to the output. So there is some flexibility here in that regard in terms of what we're going to do in any given year. The projections for the increases were, just so everybody is aware, not just being increased for the sake of increasing, but looking at what the end goal is and then backing into it. So changes in the path along the way, you change the goal, and as long as we're not taking projects out or telling some neighborhood we're not going to address their flooding, we do have some flexibility here. And I'm also struck by the fact that we do have at least next year, and next year alone, use of proceeds and balance of about $9 million. So there is an opportunity to maybe soften the continued entry of the community into the stormwater utility from what otherwise might have been sort of mathematically recommended just based on projections, because we have these unique circumstances for next year. But just so everyone's clear, that's not going to be the case the following year. And if we do want to hit the target in 2028, we're going to have to be pretty diligent about making sure that we make whatever increases are necessary in order to continue not only to invest in stormwater projects, but as Commissioner Newstead points out, once you build them, you have to maintain them, because there's no, what were the pictures that you showed earlier about those retaining walls that are falling apart? They actually then become a problem instead of a solution if they're not properly maintained. So I'd like to hear what everybody else has to say too, but I certainly am open to being flexible in something other than the recommended 10% for 2014, because I think we have some unique circumstances for 2014. And I think it would be fair to maybe at this early stage sort of soften the continued entry of the utility into the community. I don't see a problem with that if we have the ability to do it at least at this stage. I don't think we're going to have that luxury all the time, but I'd be open to that, and then want to hear what everybody's thoughts are in terms of what the number is. I know Commissioner Newstead just put one on the table. What do others think?
Put a range out there, which
a
is
range,
really
sorry.
helpful, but it's a range.
Mayor, I recognize what you just said about the use of the bond proceeds and the fund balance. For me, I think we are still at a point with this utility where it's new to the community. All properties in the community, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, or folks that are in the not-for-profit category. And I think that what we just heard, a few moments ago is there's a commitment by you and of course this council and the staff to work with, especially the not-for-profits in the community, to ensure that they're fully utilizing the credits and fully utilizing the incentive programs that we have in place, and then possibly thinking about some tweaks that we might do to enhance those programs. For me, I think that that's important for our not-for-profits. It's also important for our residential property owners, our commercial property owners, industrial property owners as well. And for me, I am uncomfortable doing such a significant increase especially in this first year when our community is still getting used to this new structure, this new fee. And for me, I'm not, given the use of the proceeds and balance this year, I'd be interested in certainly prioritizing number of projects and doing as important projects as we can. But I don't think, for me, I'm comfortable with a 10% increase. I'd be looking at more of just a straight inflationary increase for this year. And I'm talking for this year because I think the stormwater utility is still new. I think it's something that our community is still adjusting to. And I think it's something that this council has made a commitment to continue to look at. And I certainly don't want to increase the burden on our community significantly if we are going to continue, especially this year, to work with members of the community to enhance their ability to utilize the credit programs, the incentive programs as well. So that's where I'm at here. Thank you.
Well, when you say inflationary, what do you mean by that in terms of a number?
Inflation, CPI, so we're talking 2 to 3%.
The only reason I asked is because I'm not, based on, I don't know if inflation relates to the goal. I
It
know where you're
cer-
going, but I would, if there was a way to tie it to some aspect of the actual
Well, I mean,
projections, like the O&M or something like that.
Well, Mayor, what I'm really interested in here, and maybe it's cleaner to do it this way, but when I started the conversation on the previous topic, I'm interested in keeping the utility. I'm interested in keeping it in the format that it's at and at the rate at which it's at. And I think you could make a case, a good case, and some have made it to me, that keeping it at the same rate means keeping the funding coming in the same as last year. And effectively, if you don't increase it by inflation, you're holding it flat would be effectively a decrease given inflation.
I see what you mean.
So what I'm interested in is keeping it the same. I don't want to, I'm not interested currently in making changes, whether those changes be structural or fees. I want to continue in the same manner that we've been operating this year into next year. And I will say, for my colleagues, that that's not to say that I'm opposed to any increase ever in the future, but this year, given the unique circumstances around this year, the newness to the community, that's where I'm at.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I have a better understanding of where you're coming from now. Thanks. Commissioner Rankin?
I'd just like to make sure I was understanding this properly, because I don't remember exactly. So you were saying that when we implemented the utility for a $300,000 house, they got a $111 reduction in their property tax, and their fees were $100.
Yes.
Okay. So if we did the 10% increase that staff is proposing, we're still, for those people, they're still $1 ahead of the game, right?
Right. And again, just to be clear, that's not everybody's experience.
Sure, I understand that.
That's
I'm just
a
trying,
typical experience.
let me just finish.
I think they're more than
Yes,
$1
sorry.
ahead, because their property taxes would have to go up if we didn't have the utility in order to keep ramping up in this fashion. So I think what the mayor's point originally was that that $10 ahead, that $10 gap would remain. So it wouldn't be just $1, it'd be 10. But please.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so with that in mind, I do appreciate what Commissioner Newstead is saying, that I think I would be more comfortable between the 6.4 and the 10, because I think we have to be very mindful of that gap in O&M. To me, that's significant, and I think we would do a disservice to our colleagues down the road, our residents down the road, to not continue to try to improve what we're doing in operating and maintenance to keep our system operating as it should. So, brief comments, but that's pretty much it. The other thing I wanted to put out there is, if we did decide as a group not to take the non-for-profits out, I think that was kind of a decision. But are there, in regards to what Jeff was saying, are there ways that we say maybe they get a 25% reduction in their fee, or they're still payers but they get a discounted fee, or is that something that we can?
I'd love to explore ways where, I mean, again, the key of a credit isn't just figuring out some way to give somebody credit. It's to have them earn a credit by doing something that helps facilitate the overall mission of the stormwater management program. There are many different things that can be done.
Well, we learned a lot today with this discussion. It's enough policy direction to further the conversation. The structure will remain the same, but some approaches may differ. In the next couple of weeks and months, we will put some things on the table for discussion, some that came up today, some that we've been discussing since early September when we had this discussion at the council level. So in the next couple of weeks, we'd like to throw out a couple of ideas that speak to some amount of achieving our goals in a shared fashion that has a different financial impact on the NFPs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts on the proposed increase?
Yeah, I do, Mayor. You've used the term backing into a couple times, and I'd like to know what that looks like. I'm going to stray a little bit, but there's basically a cost of, one of the things that we're doing with this budget is essentially determine the cost of being a property owner in Downers Grove. There's property taxes and there's fees. My understanding at this point is that the budget is proposed, when you include some of the things that are in the property tax, most notably, I think it was the pension contributions and healthcare effects. Those two things, plus the fee considerations in both water and stormwater, present essentially approximately a 10% increase in the cost of being a property owner in Downers Grove. Is that pretty accurate?
If you look on page, I think it's 15, last page of your budget message, tab 1, it's about $74.50. I'd like to better understand what percentage it is of total cost, but that's how we calculated the impact if you stick with the fees as recommended.
What I'm getting at is that we have to be, I think, to use David's words, mindful of the cost of, living here, of the cost of being a property owner in the village, and somehow balance that with the fact that we're still very much in catch-up mode. We've got, whether it's streets or it's stormwater, we've got, years, if not decades, of catching up to do. And so I guess what I'd like to just better understand is what the effects of doing less really look like. Because I think that, the good news is everybody at the table here is nobody's arguing about the needs. And it's just sort of a question of how best we can come to a consensus point of getting to them. And I certainly agree with things that Becky and Jeff have said about that O&M part, to be sure. But Mayor, you used the softening. And I don't like the idea of using, bond money for O&M. But one of the changes that we made when we added the debt service in was we also, at least in theory on the front end, lengthened the time period by which we would try and achieve the goal.
Right.
For that very same softening
Yes.
kind of a thing. And so I'd like to see, what that looks like if it's further softened. I don't want to postpone it forever, but there are things that come to us that we can't do anything about and we have to fund, and yet we've still got people that are pretty daily challenged in town. It's not easy. As we know, most of the economic recovery that's out there is small where it exists, and in many places doesn't exist. And so I'd just like to better understand a couple of things. What's that look like if it's, instead of 2028, it's 2035? What's it look like if you basically left the 2028 goal, but you sort of spread the bond proceeds over a couple of years? What opportunities are there to have for us to minimize that sort of overall cost? Some of those aren't opportunities because they're pensions and healthcare, but some of them are.
Right.
And I'm worried about that. 10% is a big number, whether it's a fee or a tax, and more of it is non-tax deductible.
Right.
And so it worries me.
Well, that's a fair question, and it goes back to something that in different flavors over the years that I've had the privilege of being involved in this organization has been a desire to try to manage to a outcome or a bottom line. And if you're looking solely at the Stormwater Fund, then the question is, what bottom line are we trying to manage to? And then we know how much we have to pay to get to that bottom line. But if we take a step back, as you're proposing, and manage to the bottom line of the typical household in Downers Grove, if you consider everything that it costs someone to live here in terms of fees, taxes, water, garbage, everything, is there a number that we're trying to manage the overall organization to? Because then that brings in everything, which is of course appropriate, because that's what we're talking about today, is everything. It's the cost of the organization, it's personnel, it's all kinds of things. And I know that we have somewhere, because we've done it before, that little vignette of what it costs to live in Downers Grove, and we actually like to do that to compare ourselves to some other communities, because if you take certain categories, our sales tax, or the home rule sales tax, or the gasoline tax, which, by the way,
What's that gas tax called?
there's legislation to eliminate it. That's pending in Springfield right now. Even the one that's retiring the debt for the bus service.
That one.
Yeah, just to add to this.
But anyway, where I was going with this is I know we've done that before, and it's a fair question, because people will often ask, hey, I think it's too expensive to live in Downers Grove, and I think we need to understand what that means.
We made big progress. I'd like to do that again.
Yeah, I agree. And that's something I think, even if we're not managing to that number, which we may or may not query whether we should, but at a minimum, I agree with you 100% that we ought to be mindful of it.
I know it would facilitate this better if I gave you a number, and I don't have one because of that. But, when we did implement things last year, went through that exercise because we were reducing the net cost of being a property owner. So I think that's entirely appropriate to sort of keep that in front of us, again, model it
Agree with
again.
you.
So one of the things we've gotten better at is when we first started trying to model the cost of living in Downers Grove, we focused primarily on the costs just to get a handle on that side of the equation. As we've applied lean approaches to government and done the things that allowed us to achieve AAA ratings and things like that, is we started focusing more on value. What do you get for the money that you invest in your community? What services do you get? And all in that journey, we found out that there's certain times an element of pay me now or pay us more later. It's a lesson we learned in streets.
Yes.
And the
Keep
thing
the
is,
property tax levy flat, and now you have catch-up.
right, and so we're playing catch-up in two major infrastructure, well, three major infrastructure arenas right now. Stormwater, which is, you can see the dotted lines with the bond proceeds being used. Streets, where you're going to hear in a couple minutes from Andy that we're in year 2 out of a 5-year plan to rebuild streets that fell apart when we didn't properly maintain them. And Stan will tell us about the Water Fund, where we've also issued bonds to catch up on some deferred maintenance and replacement of water mains. The story on the stormwater is exactly the same. So if we were to reduce the amount of fees, reduce the amount of the increase, or lengthen the curve, the time at which we take to get there, the biggest impact is on the operations and maintenance. It's where the gap already exists, as Becky said. You can see here that we do have a lot of proceeds and money available right now for capital. This is the catch-up. But in all of these years, there's a significant gap in O&M. To the extent that that gap remains, we end up having to do this again later in greater amounts. It costs more to rebuild than it does to maintain. And so one of the things we're challenged with is when the streets start to fail, it's very obvious to the people who walk by or drive on these streets. You can see potholes. Your car bounces up and it looks bad. When our stormwater system starts to degrade and isn't properly maintained, most of it's in creeks and underground, and you don't notice it. But what you do notice is when it rains heavily, moderate to heavily,
People live next door
something
notice it.
changed. Something changed. What happened? It must be this or it must be that. Well, a lot of it is if we don't properly maintain it, the flooding, the severity of flooding could get worse. And so it's a harder story to connect the dots on because there are infrequent rain events. The types of rain events change, the impacts change based on those conditions. But the story is the same as our street story. So when we tell you what we find in that, I think you're going to see more pictures and stories coming from Nan about what happens to our system when we don't properly maintain it.
Mayor, could I make one comment?
You can make 2 comments.
25.
Certainly.
We got 9 more meetings, man.
I wanted to comment, the last time we were in this room, one of the things we discussed was the impact of redevelopment of residential properties on the stormwater system. And I'd just like to note that that's something that's in our long-range plan to discuss and consider as a medium priority item. And that's something, that's also another piece that plays in my mind. When property is redeveloped and the amount of impervious area in the village increases, then we have increased runoff and we have increased impact to our stormwater system. And I think that it's very important that we be mindful of that. And I hope that this council and staff can work with us on considering the impact of those in the future, because I think that directly relates to these operation and maintenance costs, not just this year, but well into the future, especially when we're looking at a fully funded in 2028. Well, if the profile of the village is significantly changed and regrading on properties changes the stormwater flow, then it's possible we may need additional capital projects and additional maintenance or may possibly make steps to reduce the amount that we'll need as a village. So that's something that I'm very mindful of, and this conversation really brings that home to me. So thanks.
Other comments on the proposed fee? We don't have to decide that today. As was pointed out, we have 9 more meetings. So we don't have to comment on it if you don't want to, but if there are other comments, Commissioner?
Thank you, Mayor. I, along with Jeff and Becky, agree that we should at least do the 6.4% O&M. I think that this council and the immediately prior councils have done a good job of saying, yes, these are important problems that need to be solved, and put a strategy in place to do that. And I think it's important that we stick to the plan. And I think at least the 6.4% does that. I look at the 2028 number, and I think that it's 15 years down the road to get fully funded. And then I think my 4-year-old daughter's going to be in college by the time we get that done. And I suppose we could soften it from the 6.4. I'd rather not, because I'd rather she not be in graduate school by the time we get fully funded. So I think it's important to maintain the system as we have it to the best that we can. And I think that includes sticking to the plan. I'd be willing to go above the 6.4. Whether we get all the way to 10, I guess, is an open question. Because I do think it's important that we also address the issues that we saw in April of this year. I don't know that we want to go back to our constituents and say, we know that you flooded, we saw that you flooded and the great impact it had on you, but we're going to kick that off further toward 2028. So I think it's important that we continue to work on those projects. I know that some of them will be in the hopper one way or the other, but I think it's important that we do more of them sooner rather than later, so that we can continue doing the maintenance that we need to do so that the system works the way it's intended to.
It's like diet and exercise. It's easy to put it off. It's harder to actually do it, but you know it's good for you.
Indeed.
Anything else on?
Yeah, I got some more. Don't forget, everybody, that 2028 is a pretty Ouija board kind of a thing. That's why we still actually have $12 million or $9 million of bond money, because it's a Ouija board thing. When we issued that, we thought we were going to spend it a whole lot quicker. There are 100 things that number gets less accurate the farther out you go. So it may be grad school, it may be doctorate. It also could be high school.
It'll be sooner before the states.
The thing that
Agenda.
the thing that I've heard that I really agree with and want to underscore is that O&M part. And I wonder if we couldn't, perhaps some of the softening could come from. I do better with bar charts, but if we decided that we were going to make a $2 million or $0.2 million every year increase in that O&M, just on this layout here, you'd go 22224. By 16, you'd have a smaller spread, at least on the O&M part. By removing the capital portion and using that bond proceed to soften in that aspect of it, you'd actually be slightly accelerating the O&M catch-up, while at the same time technically reducing the individual revenue component that's the 3.7 line. So you'd be taking your 15 and you'd be going to, whatever that works out to 2.3. You'd take off the 0.1 on the on the O&M and the 0.4 on the cap, and take a half off there. But committing to that 2.2222, you're going to actually accelerate the rate at which you catch up on the O&M part. That bond proceed, which didn't get spent as quick and may or may not get spent as quick down the road, could be where we have the ability to put some of that softening in without degrading the idea that we're serious about catching up on the O&M.
I see a lot of heads nodding. We can update some bar charts here moving forward with some options.
Do we want to pause now and take some public comment?
I was going for more coffee, sorry.
Well, for what it's worth, I'll go quick with the potential increase in the water rate, the pension increases, and now a stormwater utility fee increase. In light of all those, I would be only supporting, like David, 2 to 3% increase. So the tie's up to you, Mayor.
We're not making any decisions today. We don't need to. Basically, as I said, I think that it's important that we make part of the reason why we got this rating is because this council and prior councils made tough decisions. Weren't always popular, but they were tough decisions, and that's what you got to do to have a well-run organization, and that's a compliment to everybody here and our predecessors. Because it'd be easy just to kick the can down the road. It might be.
That's what happened.
Well, then you can't do that. And this is part of the reason why we got this, is because people made tough decisions, and again, they weren't always popular with everybody, but it was the right thing to do, and it's keeping our organization vibrant and healthy for the long term. That's good. The plan is for 10%, and if we're backing into this, and I agree, we could make it 2029, 2030, we could do all kinds of things. So I understand that, which is part of the reason why I'm not so wedded to the 10%, because it's a projection. A little bit better than a Ouija board, but I understand your point. It's a projection. And I just think there are circumstances in 2014, many of which people have commented on. If there's ever a solution to the pension issue, then we might not have to deal with that again, but that's out of our control. I think there's room for something less than the 10%, and I'm really, whatever the consensus is of the council is fine with me. I do think that the O&M is an important component that I tend to gravitate towards that, although whether it's 3 or it's 6 or it's 9, I mean, at some point, I think we ought to be mindful and have a justification, a rational justification for it, and not just, well, that sounds like a good number, so let's use that. But I think there's definitely room in there. So I don't have a number in mind, but I'm been appreciative of what everyone's thoughts are, and I'm open to whatever the consensus is, because I think we have an opportunity to do that for that year. I'd like to see those updated charts to the point that you just made, Commissioner. But let's just have a rational justification for whatever the number is, if it's less than 10. But I think we can do that, and I think that would be a responsible thing to do for the community, and yet still sticking with our plan and continuing to make, sticking with the planning and the tough decisions that have gotten us into the good financial shape that we are.
I do have one question, though. As we look at the different fees increases, could we also get in one of those charts what projects would be affected by this? So if we did a full 10%, here's a whole slew of projects. If we did 5%, here's what we would do. And then if we did the bare minimum, which appears David and I are at, the 2 to 3% increase, what we would do. Because I think that could really.
Yeah, that's a good question. I had asked that same one, and I think it's a good question, because I asked the same one.
Oh, well, thanks. And I didn't get a memo saying you did.
But the problem is, I've been told, is that if you look at the immediate years, we're going to get them done, because we have the means to do it. And then you start looking beyond 2016, it's too hard to say. So it's, because that was my first question is, well, let's not talk about 3 or 6 or 9 or 10. That's really not the discussion. Put a bunch of projects up on the wall. Tell me which ones people are proposing to take out, because that's what you got to look at. And then that neighborhood needs to know, guess what, your flood project is not getting done because we want to back this down.
Yeah.
And that's not the conversation, because the projects that are in the reasonable period of looking out will be done and will be funded.
Yeah, so we're going to do a lot.
It's the down the road that this would affect, and it's for the same kind of reasons Commissioner Barnett mentioned. Once you get too far out, you can't be that specific as that this project won't get done or that project won't get done once you get past 2016.
And the rest of that
So
story
this is a long-term impact.
Yeah.
Yes.
More so is how we're
Yes.
viewing this.
Because
Correct.
It's not
when,
the short term, because the
Catch
short
up
term is
here.
being covered by.
Short term is going to be okay. It's really the long term.
when this
Past
drops up
16.
700,000 or 900,000 a year in capital, and we've been doing at least $3 million a year for the last 5 years, that's the story.
You're going to see it.
You're going to see it, and what Bob and Becky and others have been talking about is making sure that more of the money goes to the O&M to make sure we maintain what's in the ground, and so,
Well,
so
I
the real
agree with
challenge is
that.
on the capital
That's
side,
pretty
right?
common sense.
Exactly. So
Does
we
the
can get you an
blue
impact on
model,
that.
does the blue model continue that essentially $100,000 increase annually?
On the O&M side, it does. On the capital side, the blue line starts to fall off on the slope because we've invested so heavily in capital here, and it shifts to maintenance, just like our street fund.
So if you were to Martin's point about having, rather than just picking a number, trying to have some sort of a, reason and structure, if you said you were gonna try and, take that O&M at double the rate of the modeled increase, you'd be setting a plan to try and accelerate the improvement in the O&M portion, even if the result was a little slower capital growth.
That's exactly right, and so we'll answer both questions in one sort of summary, give you some
That's where
scenarios.
my head is right now.
Okay.
What are we looking at over here?
I was looking at Tom
Steve,
because
Steve,
he asked
good
that
morning. How are
yesterday
you?
in the practice meeting. Shouldn't we show them where those lines cross and how they cross? Yes, Tom was right.
That was Packer fan. What do you want?
That was a recognition. All right, well then, while we're still on this topic and before we take a break, I do want to open up for any public comment with respect to anything that's been discussed so far, which has been stormwater. Any public comments or questions with respect to stormwater utility? Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Heller. I'm the president of the Church Council over at St. Andrew's Parish. I want to commend you on the quality of discussion and presentation that I saw here today. I've got a new appreciation for the job that you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. I'm going to give you a little appreciation of the job that I do.
Fair enough.
As I mentioned, I currently serve as the president. We refer to the person in charge as the warden. I won't take any questions about that. Just to give you a little background, St. Andrews, the parish, was founded in Downers Grove in the 19th century and is nearly as old as Downers Grove itself. We're located at the corner of Franklin and Saratoga, and as you are probably aware, that was an area of flooding, a regular area of flooding. It's the fourth structure to serve as the parish's home, all near this same site. The parish consists of nearly 200 households, primarily from Downers Grove, but including the surrounding suburbs, a number that has remained nearly constant for the last 10 years. And that's something we feel pretty good about because most of the churches in the area are going backwards. That's the same period of time during which I've been a parishioner and a resident of Downers Grove. I've read the village manager's report to the council regarding the feasibility of exempting the nonprofits from the proposed stormwater utility fee. And as a result of my reading of the report, my attendance at the village-sponsored workshop to promote mitigation, and the many news articles regarding this issue, I'm aware of the reasons why you're not inclined to do so. I hope that the points I'm about to make will motivate you to reconsider your perspective and allow exemptions for churches and other nonprofit organizations. As an adult, I was not a church-going person. Until becoming a member at St. Andrews, I was not fully aware of the mission of most churches, which, as I now understand, is to love God and neighbor. We put love into action and serve our neighbor, most often someone in need. Pads, sandwich board, crop walk, St. Leonard's House, community senior daycare. The list of causes that the parish and its members support directly or indirectly is long and is probably repeated in every church in this community and those nearby. We are part of the fabric of the community. The social services that churches provide the community are not funded by fees for service nor by selling passes into the heavenly kingdom. We depend on the goodwill offerings of fellow members in faith. It's their personal choice to support what the parish does. We charge nothing. We receive no outside help. The financing of our budget comes from the same people who are already paying the stormwater utility fee on their home property. They're the same people who voluntarily drive their aging or ailing neighbor to the grocery store, stand on the corner collecting coins for the Lions Club, walk to raise awareness of hunger here in the suburbs or violence in Chicago, a barbecue for rehabilitating former prison inmates, or visit incarcerated citizens to bring them the Word of God and homemade cookies. You get the idea. A good cause, and we hope and pray a good effect. It's been referred to as a social benefit theory. Churches provide needed services to the community, so they're entitled to a tax exemption. Our physical facility is built for a Sunday event. We are roof and parking lot. Very little green space remains, partly because of our downtown location. We put an addition on the structure in 2005 and looked at the feasibility of changing the parking lot to mitigate stormwater. Would we have done things differently had we been able to see this fee coming? Perhaps, but without foreknowledge or the additional space and a lot of additional dollars, it's unlikely. We're not alone. St. Joe's and First Community and probably a few others look a lot like us, landlocked. Very little, if any, undeveloped space for stormwater retention and a budget even smaller. Since becoming a member of a church, I've watched the national cultural trends play out in our small community of faith. Young people are staying away from religion in increasing numbers. As a result, the church-going population is aging. Those aging members are less likely to have a comfortable retirement, as have the generations which have recently preceded them. A shrinking and aging pool of faithful people is ringing an alarm bell for the diocese, national church, and faiths of all denominations. As these trends play out, you'll likely see consolidation of facilities. My point is that the local church on which communities depend may not be so local anymore. Willow Creek and Calvary come to mind and are names you may recognize. That mega church may be the future of religion. What impact would that trend have in this community if there were only a few churches providing community-based services and those remaining attempting to do so from facilities based in other communities, not here at home in Downers Grove? Can I draw a straight line from a proposed stormwater utility fee? one that's inflating and compounding at a double-digit rate through these trends to the demise of the community church? Probably not. But with all the financial pressures of mandated salary and benefit levels, employee training, the installation, maintenance, and inspection of mandated facility updates like fire suppression and detection systems, elevators and handicapped access, cooking hoods, defibrillators, etc., it's not a stretch. The pressure on the budget, that is the goodwill of the parish, is enormous. So for the good of us all, I'm here to plead with you to change your decision and exempt from the fee the very entities which contribute significantly to the reason we call Downers Grove home. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate your comments very much. Other questions or comments? Good morning.
Morning, Mayor and Council. Back. Very lively discussion, appreciate it. Few items, let's see, the low bar of saying that something works, that was an argument that I always kind of laughed at, because you can always pass a law and collect money and you'll find a way to spend it. So, you know, you need to get a little more specific on defining success, and I think Dave's done a job with that, but let's just be careful with when we say something works. Historically speaking, not-for-profits were discussed when the stormwater utility was first brought up 10, 11 years ago. I was in most, if not all, of those discussions. There were only about 3 or 4 residents, but there was always a concern for the not-for-profits and the churches being included in that. And the simple answer was, since there was this urgency to get a stormwater utility going, that the response always was, well, there's the Rockford versus diocese, or whatever the legal case was. So that was perfectly legal to bring in the not-for-profits and the churches. So to say that this wasn't an issue way back when, it was an issue way back when, and it was kind of steamrolled over with saying, hey, it's perfectly legal, we can do this. So, you know, there is historic, you know, it was part of the conversation. The village also has obligations way beyond stormwater. It's government for the people, I would think. And stormwater certainly is part of it, water is part of it, streets are part of it, but also so is human services. And the village was committed to human services for a very, very long time, until several years ago, when it was pretty much dumped. We got rid of our human services, our building, our department, and there was really no concern about the partnership with not-for-profits. It was done, it was said, hey, you know, there's human services, it's going to be, you know, well, we got churches and that, you know, they'll take care of it. And this idea of partnership, this partnership that we have with the schools and the park district and that, it wasn't the same with the other not-for-profits and the churches. So when human services went away and you saved money, village money that you can spend on other things, that was just something that was dumped on the not-for-profits. And now we're at the point where, you know, where you're charging not-for-profits. You consider schools as partnerships. And Commissioner Barnett brought up the point that some schools serve students outside the village. And that certainly is something that needs to be considered. Also with the, let's see, took a lot of notes. You guys were all over the place talking, and it was hard to write and keep up with conversation. You offer schools reductions almost automatically, yet the not-for-profits have to apply. You talked about reducing some of the fees for application. I understand when you give students, you know, the reduction for having students, that goes to the schools. In some cases, maybe those students are outside the village. And then when a religious education program came up and applied, they had to pay a fee. I understand they paid the fee. My understanding is they were also denied because that education was already being given to the students in the public school, in the district. So you weren't going to pay for it twice. And I thought that was rather unfair. It shows an automatic preference. As a matter of fact, as a religious education teacher, I think my argument for stormwater and taking care of the environment goes all the way back to Genesis, and it would be much stronger with a little religious bent to it than just saying it's a nice thing to do and that we need to do this. So if you're going to give a preferential treatment, I give it to the religious institutions, personally. The idea that you know, it'll mess up your system, that you're going to take too much out of the revenues, and it'll village transfers funds all the time. As a matter of fact, in the budget, you're transferring funds from the general fund to the risk management fund. And, you know, it's not a big, you have a need in the risk management fund. You can transfer funds from the stormwater utility that you collect, and you can return it to the not-for-profits, maybe through some transfer of funds or whatever, and they could show that they are a partner by doing human services. I mean, you're not rewarding a religious institution because they're religious, you're rewarding not-for-profits and churches because of the human services work that they do, which is somewhat your responsibility as well. If you take a holistic attitude towards this, not just focus on the stormwater aspect, but the fact that you're serving people, and you have a stormwater, you have human services, you have a whole range of things that you need to do. So, you know, you might try transferring funds, and I think Mayor Tully brought up grants at some point. Maybe there's a mechanism that could be set up to, you know, maybe feed with one. I was going to say tax. It isn't a tax. You can feed with one end and grant with the other, I guess. That might be one way to do it. So let's see. I think that covers everything I had. Yeah.
If not, there are 9 more meetings.
Oh, yeah, that's true. But anyway, I would rather you take a holistic approach, and I appreciate those that support somehow getting money back to the not-for-profit. Oh yeah, there was one more thing. There's the idea that we need to pay this now. You know, you have the stormwater utility residents that actually, through the various village councils over decades, they weren't, you know, the residents weren't paying their share, so to speak. We weren't keeping up. And when we get to the end of this project, you're going to have residents that are going to benefit from not having all this flooding and everything, but you are keeping the burden for paying for the catch-up costs on some middle group during this time. And I wish there was a way to spread that out a little better, because you know, I mean, I can go around my house and list all kinds of things that need doing, and I can't do them right away either. And you know, I wish there was a way you could properly spread it out between the current resident, you know, not put the burden on the current residents for the future, spread it out. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
You know, Councilman Barnett, you just said that, oh, here he goes again. Like,
Good morning, by the way.
Jim Crawford.
Thank you.
But I can only imagine what some of them are thinking now, that here I am again. But I do appreciate it. And by the way, let me echo some of the comments. It was a fascinating debate, and I do appreciate the depth in the conversation and the research that goes with it. And I do want to say right up front, I know that there is no intentional means here of punishing the nonprofits, even though we stand here feeling like we are being punished. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But first, let me clearly state, one, I am so thrilled you got a AAA. Fantastic. Saves me money. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled that you also were able to reduce the flood insurance by 5%. Many of my neighbors have to buy that, so thank you. Once again, recognizing it's your stewardship that does that. But I also want to say, although every one of you have received my vote once or twice over the last several years, The only incumbent that received 3 votes out of my household in this last election was Mr. Barnett. So even though he's standing there, 1 to 6, there are other people who are standing behind him on this issue. Because I really do believe that the approach, although unique and creative and legally justified, you're still crossing a boundary. You're still crossing a boundary of fairness. And that fairness is simple. You talk about your justification. The justification is spreading this out equally upon all people who want to participate in our community. Less than half attend church. And those who attend church, only 8% are covering over 80% of the expenses. This is documented. I actually presented you some of that documentation in one of the other speeches. That means 4% of this population is covering that 9% of the liability. And I would even argue that the other nonprofits have less participation from our local community than the churches do. So here you have 90% of this fund being covered by 100% of the population, but yet 10% only being covered by 4. Your numbers, 75% of the residents were covering the cost before, 50% of the creating the runoff. But if you take that 10% and apply it back to the 4%, that means 4% of this community is now covering 60%. We're almost halfway to the number that you already said was inappropriate. And I think that deserves a lot of conversation and a lot of thought, because you're treating the entities as individuals, and i.e. corporations do carry fiscal duty and they duty to society, but in reality, those are the people that you're asking for an extra contribution. Those same people who are doing all the social services that Mr. Heller just outlined very quickly for your city services that you can no longer provide. And finally, I just want to kind of close, because 9 more meetings, you'll hear again, I'm sure. The issue of the base. The issue of the base and how it's applied against all the other properties that go with it, and then how those taxes go with it. The simple fact of the matter is there are very unique hurdles in going after those, and those defined credits that you give do create an issue, I also believe, of fairness. So it's not only fairness of asking the different residents to participate. I was at that hearing. I voiced my opinion at that hearing. I said that this was not the right way to go about it, and the feedback, and I believe, and we can check the minutes of those meetings, was maybe the city's not ready to move forward in the way they're looking at it. But when you posted that list, every single nonprofit, Park District, the school districts, the city of Downers Grove, all had a number by it. All of those were going to contribute to that list. Now, we find that different organizations have now gotten exemptions. Exemptions that I know in your mind are justified, and I'm not questioning the intent whatsoever. But as standing here as a voter, they do seem political, and they seem political because of the property tax issue. And to say that somebody deserves an exemption for meeting their political duty, social duty to a community, i.e. creating green space or educating, where all property owners pay into that, and then give them an exemption for that duty that's being covered, but then to turn around and say to the nonprofits, you're not meeting the social duty that gets the exemption, to me is back to the issue of fairness. 2 significant issues: the treatment and the impact of those communities and the services that go with it, and saying that they were going to pay at the hearing and listing out the numbers was $66,000 for the school district, $120,000 for the park district, excluding them, and then turning around and asking for just 4% of your population. 4% and probably less to cover 9.5% or 8.75% of the budget just really does, as they say in law school, doesn't pass the smell test. Anyway, that's my opinion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Appreciate your comments. Thank you for being here.
Morning.
Good morning.
My name is Bob Ahmed. I'm a resident of Downers Grove, 4721 Wallbank. I also serve on the Parish Finance Committee with Mr. Crawford over here. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. I've already talked about the social service aspects of the not-for-profits, and I don't have anything to quantify it at this point, but that is, from my perspective, takes a huge burden off the government, which takes a huge burden off the taxpayer, and that's critical. I understand how difficult the budget process is. We do it at St. Mary's. We don't have quite big a budget. We don't have as many meetings, but we understand that obviously you have so much of revenues and expenses you've got to cover. There was a term that was bannered about, sustainability, gaining control over your revenues. We don't control our revenue source. We don't have the sustainability. Our congregation is not made up of the widow who gave from her need. We have most people that give from their want, which is discretionary. So we don't have the ability to assess a fee or levy a tax on it. We are taking gratuitous contributions from our congregation or from our parishioners. So when we get a stormwater utility bill in the mail, that is flat in the face because now we got to deal with it from a budget perspective. And I do understand and appreciate the fact that this issue has been discussed. There have been meetings brought up over time. I do appreciate the deliberation that's taking place 9 months after the utility process is already in place. But also let me bring out, those meetings also don't necessarily bring out all the details too. I attended one of those meetings, not on behalf of a not-for-profit, but on behalf of a commercial property owner relating to trying to determine what the credit would be for dropping stormwater detention facility underneath their property there. And the response that came back was, we don't have the details yet. I understand that. I get that. But what that means, and I guess what I'm trying to get across is, sometimes you don't realize what the impact is until you get the bill in the mail. And that's what happened. Okay, now we're 9 months into the process. It's hitting us now, and now we have to deal with it. I also agree 100% with your discussion about taking advantage of all the credits. I think we try to with the education credit, but also keep in mind, and using the education credit as an example, is that we're already pressed with this core curriculum aspects in our schools. And so when we have to take a piece of the education process and allocate it towards something to try to get a credit, it's taken away from core curriculum, which means we're taking it away from something else. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Good morning.
Good morning. Todd Paradis, 417 67th Court, Downers Grove. Again, I echo the thing about the AAA rating. That was great news for the village. I actually had a call with Dave that Friday when it came out. And that was the first topic of conversation. Sent Sean an email. I felt around shattering because he was doing backflips.
I'd pay to see that.
I'm in a little bit different direction. I mean, when this whole stormwater thing came up, one of the things that I mentioned was, getting the credits right. And, you get a one-time credit for a rain barrel. Personally, I don't like the way the rain barrel looks, so I don't want it on my property. My downspouts and sump pump go into the ground. Therefore, I'm doing exactly what the village wanted people to do, is control their stormwater runoff. So I think, that's one issue, and it's one time. It doesn't make sense, because if you have the rain barrel, it's filling up, you're using it, but you get one-time credit. I understand that you want to go with the simplest way because cost benefit of it, but it just doesn't make sense to me that if we're controlling our stormwater runoff, we don't get that type of credit, and ongoing credit. Second thing is, in a lot of those credits, it's just cost prohibitive. If you're a commercial place, you have to have all these engineering drawings done, and if you don't have somebody on staff or a church has it, it's cost prohibitive. You're going to get a credit of $5, or just hypothetically, and it's going to cost you $5,000. Nobody's going to do it. I mean, you're just not going to get the return on it. So to say that some of these not-for-profits aren't taking advantage of it, it's cost prohibitive for them. I mean, they don't have the money in the first place. So I think, the credit things is something that really needs to be looked at and make it a little bit easier. I mean, I've resolved myself that, not-for-profits are probably not going to get any type of credit. My church in Downers Grove here, we have a big retention pond, but in order to get a credit, education credit, the village is going to tell us how to educate our kids now. I mean, one of the things you have to do is submit the curriculum, I understand. So the village is now going to be taking on an education or telling us how to educate our kids. It just doesn't seem right. So I think that was, that's what I had. I mean, good thing there's 9 more meetings because you guys are going to be here until about 4 o'clock today if we're going to go at this pace. But in any event, I do have some other things, but I'll save it for a different meeting when that topic comes up. But, it's a tough job that you guys do, and certainly appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here. Thanks for your comments. Other questions, comments from members of the audience? Good morning.
To the mayor and the commissioners and staff members who are here. I'm new to these proceedings. My name is Dave Schlegel. I'm the pastor at North Manor Baptist Church in Downers Grove, and I'm also a Downers Grove resident, accompanied here by another of our church members, Mr. Chuck Mathis, who's also a Downers Grove resident. And Chuck may speak for himself in a moment. I don't know. But let me just, echo the things that have already been said and said far more eloquently and thoroughly than I would be able to add to. But, I agree with the aspects of the human services, social services that are provided via churches, and just some of the numbers I get. I'm a numbers geek, and I appreciate, the man who worked the percentages and things, and those things resonate with me, and we certainly are sympathetic to that. It's been mentioned earlier, I think maybe, Mr. Mayor, you had said, nobody likes having an added fee. And so this does strike churches particularly hard. We've talked a lot today about softening, the impact on the community. And as a taxpayer and a resident, the impact of this has been subtle, but but as a church, our situation is probably a little bit unique. I'm told, I don't know if this is true, that as churches go, we pay the highest fee. For 2013, we will pay $8,400 in stormwater fees. And that's driven by the fact that many, many years ago, someone in our church had a big vision, and we have a big parking lot. We've talked about taking it out, but as has been said, when you have very, very limited resources, that's not a small undertaking to do something like that. That may be something that we're compelled to have to dig into. Our church has in the past, some 15 years ago or whatever, had some serious hurt done by some folks that were then a part of the church. And so now we are numerically a much smaller church. We still have a lot of facilities, and we're thankful for those facilities, but what we don't have is cash flow. We got a lot of green space, a lot of parking lot, a good-sized building, and so with the formulas as they are, we're pretty seriously impacted, financially. And one of the struggles is the uncertainty of the increases. We've talked about everything today from 2 to 10%. I went through and did the numbers here based on what you have on the chart, and just showing. And then I extrapolated out. I said, okay, if we do 8% a year out through year 15, our fee, as presently is arranged in year 15, would be something like $22,000. If the increase were 11% from there going forward, year 15, our fee would be something like $30,000. Over those 15 years, the total for us, that puts us in the $200,000 to $250,000 range over 15 years. That may not be a big number for, from the village standpoint. That's a huge number to us. Our average salary, we have a small Christian school, about 15 full-time employees. The average compensation level for those employees is about $32,000 a year. So when we're talking about a couple $100,000, $250,000 over a period of years, that's a huge impact. And so we're feeling that pain, and as has been said, it's difficult to generate, to levy revenues. We're Lord provides for us. He doesn't often provide for us in excess, but He provides for us what we have need of. And so we're grappling with this. Now, the mayor has suggested many times, used the word ameliorate, I don't know how many times, and the idea, the desire for people to pursue incentives and those aspects, and we are exploring that, and we'll need to explore that. But one of the unique things about our property also is if you look on the floodplains, we are actually outside the Downers Grove watershed. We are south of that. We're right down the south edge where everything around us is Darien. But we sit right on there. So our water doesn't even flow into Downers Grove. It goes, at least from what I understand, from looking at the drawings, that's the way it goes. You look like you're going to...
Yeah, if that is the case, you can talk to Karen right there because you'd be eligible for a direct discharge credit, a large one.
I have investigated that, and we will have to pursue that. The mayor asked, why do people not pursue that? Well, as has been mentioned, we've got to provide a certified engineer drawing in order to be able to justify that. That's not cheap. There's an application fee. It might seem like small change, but even that's not cheap. And the ironic thing to me is I believe we are entirely outside the Downers Grove Watershed District, but the maximum credit that we are allowed to get is 50%. So even though apparently all of our water goes the other way, we're still contributing 50%. And just in light of all the details, that strikes me as not a great system. But I understand you've got, we're a unique exception in that way, and you've got a lot of considerations. But just wanted to give you an example of how this impacts one particular ministry, one particular churches, and I appreciate these other churches, and they all have their own unique challenges as well. But we share the reality that this is a fee that has come on to us in large amount very suddenly, with an uncertain prospect of where it's going. There is some opportunity for the amelioration, but it's limited, and it is, I think Mr. Barnett said it's painful, you know. The mayor said, why don't people do it? He said, because it's a pain, and there's truth to that. And there's an investment cost up front with, you know, there's a 45-day, I think, suspense to make an adjudication on it, but there's an uncertain return on that expense. So if we go out and hire an engineer and go through that process, you know, that you still never know till it's over what the real impact is going to be. So those are some thoughts that I have. I appreciate the council's consideration. I've invested a lot of time on the concerns of churches. I appreciate that. Appreciate Commissioner Barnett in particular being the one among seven who is standing firmly in that regard, but I know others have made comments and a sensitivity to the burdens that are upon churches and nonprofits, and I appreciate that as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your comments. Other questions or comments? Morning.
I'm Greta McDonald from the First United Methodist Church right downtown in Downers Grove, and just wanted to say that some of the concerns we're having are being echoed by the other clergy who have spoken. We have a strong commitment in our congregation to environmental stewardship, and so we're struggling with how we can live this out in a way that protects who we need to also be as a church in this community. So we thank you for your discussion. We appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. Other questions or comments on this topic?
I have a question of a practical nature.
Can you come up here? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's being recorded, so we wouldn't want it to be lost to posterity.
All right. The question is in regard to identification of the projects that you have on the board and the need for them as you go forward and the mitigation requirements of the village are implemented. Are you going to have the same need for the projects that you've identified or ones in the future if your development and redevelopment of properties here in the community are subject to mitigation requirements and retention and all of those other things?
That's an excellent question, and it actually raises two different things. One, part of the reason why it's a Ouija board once you get out past 2016 is you can only estimate. You don't really know until you assess the environment closer in time to the period that you're looking at. There have been instances where we have expected that a certain number of projects would need to be done, and either because they come in under budget or one project is more successful than previously thought, or circumstances change due to other development or redevelopment in the area, that you end up finding that you don't have to do the same scope or magnitude of project that you did before. And so that all factors into it. So if your question is, are there things that could change in the future that might make the end goal number different? Yes. And unfortunately, that goes both ways. There could be things that change that make it worse, but there could be things that change that make it, bring that target down a little bit. We've actually had some experience with that since we have bonded out for some stormwater projects, and that's part of the reason why we have a proceeds balance, is because some projects we found out after we got into and started doing some regional solutions that it solved other problems, and therefore there were projects that didn't need to be done. So this is why we're going to do this every single year. Sit down in 2014, 2015, 2016, and look at what is the current environment now, and what can we reasonably expect in the near future. And if those numbers dictate something other than what's being projected, then that's what it'll be. And to go back to that point, this is all about a target of what do we want to have in terms of stormwater management infrastructure, and then backing into it. And there's all kinds of room for moving around in there, as long as the target doesn't change. The target could change, depending on what the circumstances are in the future. But assuming for a moment a fixed target, any adjustments mean either changing the time or the scope of getting to the end result. Now, if we take this out, or we reduce this in, or we increase credits, it all has an impact upon the target unless you change the target. And can we change the target? Sure, we can change the target. But then we're back to the question that Commissioner Durkin asked, okay, what projects are not going to get done? Or what projects won't get done for another 5 years? And that goes back to our streets issues of, do we want to be caught up? And right now we're projecting being at a point in 2028 where we want to be, but we'll see. No one can, long answer to a short question.
Good answer.
Other questions or comments on this? Stormwater, while we're on it? just very quickly, and then I'm going to suggest that we take a break. I don't think there's anyone at this table that doesn't appreciate and understand that there's a budget impact upon the faith-based organizations, not-for-profits. I don't think there's anybody at this table that isn't acutely aware of that in either our elected official position or in our personal position. I think just about all of us here spend a lot of time, not as much as you, but a lot of time at various not-for-profits that support a lot of the missions you're talking about. And I think we also work very hard to either partner ourselves with various organizations to help achieve that mission, or try to encourage public-private partnerships that can do so. I'll give you a quick example. Midwestern University and their dental clinic is looking to work in partnership with with Hope's Front Door, formerly known as the Walk-In Ministry of Hope, which I know all the churches are aware of, and so that the Hope's Front Door can now offer to its clients, which serve those in immediate need, often the same type of people that come to you, the dental clinic services from Midwestern University. So here's an example of a not-for-profit and a private institution working in partnership to raise the bar in terms of what type of human services are provided in our community. That's the kind of thing that as a village we can encourage, facilitate, bring that together, make that happen. Community benefits, and yet we don't need to change anything here in our budget to make that happen. So just be mindful that that's also going on behind the scenes. We're all very mindful of that. The only issue that I take with it is I would like to find a way within the system to achieve some kind of result that would be beneficial to the not-for-profits, faith-based and otherwise, that are feeling the impact most acutely. And if the current fee system or credit system is not doing it, we are completely, and have said since the beginning of this, we are open to considering maybe ones that don't currently exist. And again, we'll have that conversation. That conversation is ongoing. There might be ones that do make sense for your organization. So maybe the education credit doesn't work. Well, let's talk about one that might. I just had a crazy idea. Don't fall out of your chair. But we do routinely waive permit fees and application fees all the time. So maybe if one of the burdens is the fee to apply for the credit, maybe that's something we can address, because we do that for not-for-profits all the time.
It's already eligible under our program, and they are waived if requested.
So that should not be a hurdle. If there's a fee to apply for the credit, that's something we do and have waived. The social services comment is a fair one, to go back to what I said earlier. But the issue I have is if there's a social human services component in the community, and I know Bill's going to love hearing me say this, I think there's a different way for the village to more directly impact that. I don't think trying to support human services and needs in the community through a stormwater utility exemption, that's kind of an indirect way to get there. If there's an issue there, I think we're better served by hitting that issue head on, either through, as I said, an example of where we partner with someone, or we facilitate partnerships outside of the village between other organizations to meet those needs. But everyone here is acutely aware of that and want to try to continue to work. Reach out if we have to. Come and knock on the door. Make the phone call. Commissioner Barnett and I will come over with a pitcher of coffee and we'll talk about it. We want to continue to have that conversation, try to see how we can do it, rather than wholesale exemption from the program. I think that's the only difference here. And then last, well, I'll leave it with that. I was going to start talking about fairness and equity, but I think everybody just has different opinions on how that all works, and I don't want to take up any more time at almost 10 o'clock to get into that discussion. But thank you for being here. You have been engaged in this dialogue for some time. We appreciate it, and really do want to continue to work and try to find a solution. No one's saying we don't want to find a solution. It just may not be the same solution that's being proposed. So thank you all for being here on this topic. 10-minute break, or do you have anything you want to say before we go to commercial? Nope. All right, well, let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 10 o'clock. All right, so we just had a very robust conversation about stormwater, which was very helpful, and now we're on to streets and capital.
So we'll start with the water fund at 10 o'clock here, and here's Stan Balicki to walk us through this fund.
Sorry, water, then streets and capital.
Good morning. Thank you, Dave. I will just be taking a few minutes to walk through the water fund for 2014. There are three key takeaways as we see these slides for the water fund to just be mindful of. The first is that for 2014, the village will be in the position of spending down the fund balance in this fund due to the bond proceeds that are still remaining in that fund. The second is that the rate increase in the water fund for 2014 is proposed to be lower than expected due to some operational efficiencies that we've seen. And we're also going to be proceeding with capital improvements that'll be emphasizing primarily on water main replacement. You can see from this first chart what I explained as far as the expenses exceeding the revenues. We've got revenues of about $13.6 million that are almost exclusively from the water fees that are charged to the customers as part of the water utility, and expenses of about $17.31 million. And again, the expenses exceed the revenues as the village continues to spend down the proceeds of the 2012 bonds. It's got a few photos of the water system there. So what are the objectives of the water fund? Downers Grove provides clean, safe, and reliable water service to residents and commercial establishments in and around the village. We serve a residential population of approximately 50,000 people with a service area that includes all areas within the village and limited areas outside the village. You can see from this slide that the water system that the village owns and maintains is an extensive system of a variety of storage and distribution facilities. Our water supply is Lake Michigan water that's supplied through the DuPage Water Commission. And the system is operated on a daily basis by the Water Division, which is part of the Public Works Department. In 2010, we completed a water rate study, and the study was to review the current and future water rates to ensure that there was adequate funding for future operations and maintenance, as well as identified capital maintenance and improvement projects. You can see from this slide the four components that make up the annual revenue requirements within the water fund. We have our operating and maintenance expenses, planned capital improvement projects, outstanding debt, and then contributions to reserves. Those four items together make up the annual revenue requirement for water. This slide shows proposed water rate increases that were recommended in the water rate study, which is referred to here in this slide as the original plan. The second line shows the rate increases that were the result of the increased cost of purchasing water that occurred. And you can see that for 2014, staff is recommending an increase of 7% as a result of lower than anticipated costs in operations and maintenance. And that's lower than the 10% that was part of the original plan. This slide breaks down the major cost centers within the water fund for 2014. And I think most notable in this, you can see that $7.86 million, or about 45% of the expenses, are for the cost of water itself that the village purchases. Another $3.88 million under operations and maintenance is about 22% of the overall expense. The remaining being obviously for capital and debt service. This last slide shows the chart of the projects that are planned, water projects that are planned for 2014. There are a total of this $4.9 million that are planned for next year. 4.3 of that is earmarked towards water main replacement projects. So there's a major emphasis in the work that is scheduled for next year. And that is a very quick summary of the water fund. Be happy to answer any questions.
Questions or comments on the water fund?
I think I had one, Mayor. Let me find where I put my notes. Was there a 55th Street, 55th and Main project, 55th and Maple?
Water main replacement, Maple and 55th.
It's right here. Is that tied in with the county project, or is the county project going on 55th Street East?
I have to
Mixing
look
up
towards
those projects.
Nan or Andy on that one. I'm not entirely sure.
That project, Main and Maple was the original, 55th and Maple was the original name of the project. It actually is a little bit further east of there, from Blodgett to Fairview is where this phase is being done.
Okay.
And it's gonna be a water main lining, so there'll be very little digging of the roads.
Okay.
But we should get it done before the county comes through to resurface.
Okay. That's the, just wanted to make sure they were coordinated. That's all.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments on the water fund from any members of the council?
Again, consistent with many years of planning here, so no surprise, not a lot of questions.
Right. Any questions or comments from the audience with respect to the water fund?
Next on our agenda is the Capital Projects Fund, found on page 428 of the budget book. Andy Sikich, Assistant Director of Public Works.
We just got 1 minute back on our schedule.
Good morning. I'll try not to take it up. Good morning. I'm just going to give you a real brief overview. The takeaways here, as with water, we're doing what we said we were going to do, and it's working. It's a good news story. So as you can see from this slide, in the Capital Projects Fund, we've got revenue coming in of $7.89 million, but the budgeted expenditures are $18.63 million. And again, as with the other funds, that reflects a spending down of the bond issuance from 2012. Okay, so the revenues in this fund are varied. They come from the home rule sales tax, property tax, local gas tax, and telecom tax. Again, they're reflecting the spending down of the bonds, and primarily we're dealing with roadway maintenance and reconstruction and sidewalks out of this fund. As everybody knows, the objective of our program is to maintain these streets at the most cost-effective level and coordinate with all the other projects that we're doing. Everybody knows what our street system is made up of. You can see it on the slide above. Everybody's seen this slide a bunch before. Basically, we need to maintain the streets before they fall apart. This is what they look like when they're in a maintainable condition. This is what they look like when they're not in a maintainable condition and we have to rebuild them. Here's one. This is a good project we did this year, Washington Street downtown. We combined water main, sanitary, storm, sidewalks, and accessibility improvements all into this project while resurfacing this road. So, I mean, it was a great project. We had very little impact to our downtown businesses throughout as well. Oak Grove up north, full reconstruction. Again, very minimal disruption to businesses. The streets up there are going to be in much better condition for a long time to come. And here's a typical roadway maintenance. We resurface about 10 plus miles like this every year of our system now. So, you know, between these and the roadway reconstruction projects, the system is vastly improving, as we'll see in a little bit. So here's a summary of the 2014 budget for roadways. About $5 million going to maintenance, which is resurfacing and patching and crack filling. The reconstruction projects, this year we've got planned $9 million out of the 2012 bonds. And then about slightly under $400,000 for design for 2015 projects. Here's a slide that's been updated. You've seen this a couple times before. This is the road reconstruction projects that were dedicated with the $25 million bond. The ones with the check marks next to them are done or soon to be done. The 2013 projects are just about completed. For those projects, the number next to those are the actual amounts. So the good news here is we've seen some significant savings in these projects, which has allowed us to add even more streets that were identified for reconstruction and still stay within this $25 million bond. So you can see at the bottom, we're still at the $25 million. In 2014, we've got Esterbrook subdivision, Brook and Center, which is up north, and Downers Grove Estates, all to be reconstructed in 2014. Okay, so how are we doing? I think you've seen this slide before, but I think it bears repeating. In 2010, we identified that about 22% of our streets needed reconstruction. After we did the bond issuance, we did some work, we reassessed. At the end of 2012, we estimated that was about down to 16%, and we estimate by the end of 2015, we'll be down to 1% of the streets in the village that are in need of reconstruction. That's kind of our ongoing target, because we'll never be at a point where no streets need to be reconstructed. So that 1% number is what we would like to continue to maintain in perpetuity. So that's it for roads. You want me to go right into sidewalks?
Questions on streets, street maintenance, or use of those bond proceeds?
Open call. Any questions on streets?
Am I skipping too much?
I hope we can go through stormwater slides that fast in a few years.
Yeah,
5 years? Okay.
That's funny, but that's exactly the goal.
That's the correlation we were just talking about.
Because we did have those circling nonstop.
I was going to ask Dave to turn this slide into a stormwater slide, but not with tire tracks, with some sort of pipe half full or 3/4 full.
That's what we're going to do with those bar charts. So it's the same story again, so we'll be able to make the policy decisions. Rain gauges.
Yeah. Ethan Cumner, I go over there when it rains and see a geyser from the sanitary district, but that's a different story.
Okay.
Sidewalks.
Sidewalks.
Please.
Okay, sidewalks, again, staying the course, no big surprises. Village currently has about 242 miles of sidewalk. We've got about 3 miles of identified new sidewalk segments yet to be constructed. As we know, the village has a policy of constructing new sidewalks on at least one side of every street. So we're just about there. Our objectives here, obviously, we want to maintain what we've got. We want to construct new sidewalks per the policy, and then we're also improving crosswalks and sidewalk ramps to enhance accessibility. We've all seen these slides here. New sidewalks where we try to incorporate them into the neighborhood with as little impact as possible. Here's one of our new improved crosswalks downtown. This one also has some adjacent accessibility improvements with the sidewalk ramps. And then here's the program for the year. FY14 budget, $201,000 roughly for replacements. I think we rounded that. New sidewalks, $650,000. And paver crosswalks and accessibility improvements are $350,000 for about $1.2 million for next year for the program. That's it.
There are 2 medium priority projects that will affect sidewalk funding going forward. One is, what do we do as we get down the list? We have about 3 miles left. How are we going to finish up that list? Are we going to finish up that list is a medium priority item. How we approach sidewalks on Ogden Avenue is a policy discussion we're going to have in the coming months. So these things, the plans may change going forward, but this is really the last year of for sure sticking to the plan that's been in place for many years, and that's exactly how you see the investment of $1.2 million.
Okay, so we're not going to change the matrix until 15, is what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
From a budgeting standpoint, for now.
Correct.
that's the answer.
And it's important to understand that as we are so far down on the matrix, instead of picking in exactly the order they appear on the matrix, we pick the projects that make sense from a project coordination. Are we going to do them with streets? Are we going to do them with a water main project? And we also try to get the best pricing for the construction by picking areas that are proximate to each other to reduce staging and operational expenses. But we are so far down the line on the sidewalk policy, the matrix, that we're in a position to be able to do that.
Terrific. Other questions, comments on sidewalks?
I've got an accessibility question. Are we doing those at our pace, or are we compelled to meet some federal criteria? Okay.
The answer is both. We are doing them at the pace that our budget affords us, and the federal government, the ADA, requires us to make some substantial movement every year on this. So there's...
It's not quantified. It's not like our sign thing where everybody's got to have every intersection accessible by 2020, nothing like that.
That's correct. I'm looking at Allison. She's working with David too. Yeah, that's our understanding, is we just have to demonstrate that we're making progress. And I think we are hitting that just fine with the amount we're investing. It's within our budget, but pursuing the ADA requirements.
Is there grant opportunities available for those kinds of projects?
We will always look for grant opportunities. We'll continue to look. I don't know for sure we'll get that question answered.
But this is one of these unfunded mandates.
Correct.
For the federal government.
Correct.
Yes, it is.
Are you finding a percentage of the replacement program that you're, instead of replacing, you're doing grinding? Is there more grinding happening, or is there more replacement happening? Where are we at with how that's working out?
A significant part of that has now become where we don't grind, we saw cut the trip hazards.
That's what I meant, right.
And that's become actually a real cost-effective way for us to eliminate trip hazards where the sidewalk otherwise wouldn't need to be replaced. So that's part of that $201,000.
Other questions, comments, any from the audience with respect to sidewalks? The stalwart ones who've remained?
Do we have accessible sidewalks around the fire station?
Yes, it was
Good.
built
Just
into
making
the...
sure.
Good thing.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for pointing that out.
It's a good point, though. In addition to this, we do incorporate accessibility into all of our new projects and road maintenance program.
Terrific, thank you.
You bet.
General fund, we just, in the first part of this meeting, talked about $33 million worth of village spending. We're now going to talk about $43 million, so you get the order of magnitude. The general fund is our main operating fund, and we have worked very hard to become sustainable in our general fund over the last several years. We are sustainable right now with revenues and expenses in alignments. Revenues about $43.8 million, expenses about $43.6 million. You will see in our presentation here today that we are improving the use of fund balance by working together with the Risk Management Fund. We are implementing the Affordable Care Act, and you'll see how that impacts us. And you'll see how the property taxes change. No increase for operations, the only increase for mandatory contributions to the Fire and Pension Fund. This is a graph we've been using for about the last 6 years. It shows on the top red line revenues in the general fund over time. You can see there is good news. Revenues are increasing, driven by modest increases in almost all of our revenue sources. Not all, but almost all. Sales tax, property taxes, income taxes are on the rise. So modest growth in revenues. A similar graph for expenses. Expenses total in the general fund are the top blue line. They are also increasing, but not as fast as revenues. So that is good news. Most of our expenses are due to personnel expenses. That makes sense because we are a customer service organization, and it's the people that provide those services. The personnel expenses are up, again, primarily driven by the mandatory contributions in pension funds. Just a couple of months ago, we had a discussion at Long Range Planning that said, you know, we should be using our reserves and fund balances more strategically, not only to manage risk, but to increase the value of those reserves, those funds we have on hand, to fund village operations. That was the direction given in Long Range Planning, and the way that plays out is we are proposing a transfer of $4.2 million from the general fund to the risk fund. There's also a transfer of obligations, if you will. We will use the risk fund for more things, including responding to unexpected costs of emergencies and disasters. So we're moving money out of the general fund. We're also moving responsibility from the general fund to the risk fund. Those things result in a more predictable and stable general fund. So if we have another flood event and we saw expenses spike in the general fund as we responded, that won't happen under this model. It would be in the risk fund, leaving the general fund more predictable, more sustainable, better able to budget general fund operations. It also results in the reduced likelihood of budget amendments, which have always been a challenge at the end of the year when you have to go through and adjust. We are budgeting in a manner in the risk fund that also reduces the likelihood of budget amendments in the risk fund. Most importantly, even after this transfer of $4.2 million from general to risk, the general fund balance remains within our existing policy. So we are sustainable in the general fund, and we also get all these other benefits in the risk fund by making this transfer. The National Affordable Care Act implements this year. It does affect our budget. Good news. We are well positioned to avoid large increases known as the Cadillac taxes in the future. Why? All the things we have been doing over the last 4 or 5 years to reduce our cost, make it a consumer-driven health plan, are the exact kind of things we should be doing to avoid those Cadillac taxes. So the impact this year is an $86,000 increase, which is a direct result of taxes and fees based on the number of people that participate in our plan, and so therefore they are unavoidable under the CARE Act. So $86,000 is the impact of Affordable Care Act in our general fund. I want to briefly go over the village property tax. Most of the property tax levy revenue we receive from property taxes goes into our general fund. It is imperative to understand that the village levies a particular dollar amount, and then how much any property pays is based on their property value as compared to all the other value property in the village of Downers Grove. Who determines that? The assessor, the township assessor, tells you how much your property is worth, and more importantly, what it's worth in comparison to the other properties within our village. So we levy a dollar amount. The assessor determines the value of your property, and there's an equation that results in a tax rate. The rate is a product or an outcome of the levy. There are 5 components to the levy. You can see them here. Our total levy will go up by $583,000, an increase of about 5.3%. 3 of the line items remain unchanged. Those are village operations and village capital expenses. 2 of the line items change. That accounts for all of that $583,000 increase. Fire and police pension contributions. These are driven by a change in the actuarial assumptions. All the actuaries across the country, in doing their analysis of the pension funds, are using updated mortality tables that show our plan participants living longer. When people live longer, the cost of providing them a pension goes up. That is what's driving this. There was also a small change in the rate of return assumption for the fire pension fund, bringing the return assumptions more in line with what's actually occurring in those funds. It's important to understand that these contributions are mandated by state law, and the Village of Downers Grove is in a position, has and will continue to make all of the required contributions. The impact of the tax increase due to those changes on a typical property is about $27.60 per year. About $27.60 per year. You say to yourself, well, I pay a lot more in taxes than the $500 and some that showed up on that slide. That's correct. We all pay more than that. It's because there are many other taxing bodies on your tax bill, and the village is only about 9%. So 9% of your tax bill goes to the Village of Downers Grove. We've talked about a lot of things here this morning. I just want to sort of wrap up and really circle back to where we started, and that's the impact of the budget changes on a typical house in Downers Grove. We just showed the property tax changes. We talked about the stormwater fee as proposed when we started this morning of about $10. And Stan walked us through the only 7% increase in water fees for a typical house. That's about $37. For a total impact of under $75 per year. I think it's a good place to end our presentation today, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for the concise presentation. Question, comments with respect to general fund items?
I just like to comment. I think this is really a great news story. If you look at the places where expenses are increasing, police pension, fire pension, Affordable Care Act, I mean, there's a significant amount of these increases in expenditures that are mandatory. I would say, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I think it's a majority of these expenditure increases are mandatory under whether it's state or federal law. And I think that basically what that shows is this village and the staff and our budgeting team and have done just a phenomenal job in controlling the costs that we can control. And I just want to say thank you to the staff for all the work on this, and I'm very excited about this story and especially this part of the story. So thank you, Mayor.
Thanks, Commissioner. Other questions?
I'd just like to compliment staff on a beautiful budget. I mean, just the way it's presented is so user-friendly. I love all those call-outs that gives a little more detail and the noteworthy changes. It's just very easy to understand compared to a couple years ago. It was harder to understand. So it's just a wonderful job of explaining what's happening and why. So thank you.
I'll just give, a lot of people worked on this, but I'll give special credit to Judy, who oversaw the financial discussions, and Allison, who oversaw the production and layout, and supported by all sorts of folks. There's too many to name, but clearly we think the budget, the numbers are not just reflective of our work, but the presentation and how we try to better engage with our community. So thanks to those folks who did that.
I wonder how many other budgets have been called beautiful, but that should be a banner that we put up. But this is why we win awards. I mean, we joke about the wall of GOFA awards that are out there, but this is it. This is the fact that we can have a 3-hour meeting and talk about some seriously huge dollar amounts. I think that goes back to not only long-range planning, but back to the long-range planning and strategic planning from the year before. It's a culmination, as Dave said at the very beginning of our meeting, of all the hard work from not only this council, but of course our staff and our residents for giving their input and their feedback, because we've all been in these meetings before where they've lasted a heck of a lot longer because we've had less positive information, but also bigger decisions to make that affected the future of this organization. And I think we're at a point now where with sustainable revenue, good projections and good estimates on expenses, we're in a great spot to move forward. So thank you to everybody for your participation and your hard work.
Well, I echo all three of those comments. Other questions or comments on the general fund? Questions from the audience?
I got one last one on the stormwater fund.
Oh, we're going to go, 2.5 hours wasn't enough?
I forgot about it, though. But I'll make it.
Sure, we'll take it now.
I mentioned it last year when the stormwater fund was created. Under that.
Good morning, Mr. LaCrette.
4-21, we have the monies that are coming in listed under sales. Should be under fees.
Yeah, we're going to move it.
But otherwise, we're not charging a fee, and we get into trouble with that.
I
It should be under fees.
just heard Judy say we'll move it. I think a couple of commissioners asked about that very same thing.
We had some
problems with some software.
Thank you for pointing that out. Hello again, Bill.
Hello? I don't think I introduced myself last time officially. Bill Waldeck, 1409 Willard Place. Dave, one of my favorite numbers, I didn't work it out yet. If you happen to know it, that'd be great. But when I would go through the various things we had to vote on over the years, and there was an amount of money given, I used to like to put it in terms of how much does it add to $1 on the tax bill. For example, it was at one time $20,000 was the equivalent of $1 on the taxes. And I was wondering if that number changed or if you can work it out somehow. Don't need that now, but
we determined that it does change very slightly because of the declining base upon which we're working, the EAV. It's still very close to that number, but it's gone up just a little bit because the base upon which we're applying it has shrunk a little.
and since it's such an estimate anyway, so we could probably say maybe $25,000 is the equivalent of $1 on the tax bill.
We'll get that number for the council and you as well, Bill.
Yeah,
But it's
I mean,
very
just
similar to when you were on the council.
Very estimate. Okay, thanks.
The other thing I wanted to tail on what David was saying about the good news is, you know, so we're having to make choices about water fees and the stormwater fees, and the planned stormwater fee was 11%, and the water fee was going to be 14% increase, and the proposed increases are less than that, so that's another good bit of information.
Agreed. And just to sort of sum things up, our 2014, 2015 high priority action items include a number of things, but one that isn't called out is something that guides, I think, everything that we do, and that is serving as good stewards of the public trust and the public dollars. And clearly with respect to those things, as has been pointed out, that we have within our control to manage, this is an exceptional outcome once again, and all are to be congratulated. Essentially everything is remaining flat except for those things, as Commissioner Olson pointed out, are being forced upon us from the outside. So that's terrific. But to pick up on Commissioner Rankin's comments, one of the other high priority action items we have is to continue to improve resident engagement and communication. And so the comments about this being a beautiful budget are not just flippant, but are directly in line with one of our highest priorities, because the document does allow not just the council to better understand and work with the budget, but it allows the community at large to do so. And so that's a very important item to be underscored. And again, I'm going to keep saying it until people stop me. That's why we get these things like the AAA bond rating, is because of these efforts. So they have very meaningfully positive impact upon the entire community, and that's greatly appreciated. So thank you for all those efforts. Any closing questions or comments from any members of the council? Understanding, of course, we do have how many more meetings?
Several more meetings starting as soon as Tuesday. There's a slot on the agenda.
Terrific. And it is a continuing process. And anyone who's been following this knows that there will be ongoing conversation, discussion. And just because we talked about it today doesn't mean we'll talk about it tomorrow and the day after that. And who knows, might even have a new idea somewhere along the way. Thank you for everyone in attending. Thank you for our guests for being here. Appreciate it, particularly at the early hour of 7:30. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. We're adjourned.
Thank you, Mayor.